It was a sunny, beautiful day. A father and son are standing on a hill looking down at the workers cutting down trees. The father asks his son what he thinks about a question. What does he think is the most necessary virtue for a lord? The son looks at his father with curiosity and uncertainty. He is surprised by this turn of events. Why this question? He answers uncertainly that it is probably generosity. The father says that this is not a bad answer. The son then asks, what is the right answer if he is wrong? The father replies that the most important virtue for a lord is a kind and warm heart. The father is Richard Valencia, Lord Leshill. The son did not understand his father's answer and asked him if he thought he had a good heart. Then the father began to explain that the virtue required of a lord depends on the situation in each case. A lord must be able to be a friend, a part of the family, and sometimes a villain. And his son must learn to be in all these different roles. And no matter what situation he finds himself in, as long as he does his best, he will be able to form an alliance with anyone he meets in his life. Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from outside. A laborer was running toward them with a question. When the worker came running up, he apologized for interrupting their conversation and asked the Lord to do one thing he knew of, if it was not difficult. Richard replied that yes, he would do it without any problem. But before he did, he asked his son Simon and the laborer Charles to step aside. The tired laborer breathed a sigh of relief. And the Lord stretched out his hand and began to say the spell. Simon watched his father's magic with admiration. Richard summoned a portal from which waves of black magic began to erupt, covering the ground in front of him. Where the magic hit the ground, it began to boil and bubble. From this boiling liquid, skeletal hands began to appear. And in a second, almost a dozen full-length skeletons rose from the puddle with the characteristic sound of bones clattering. The skeletons began to stare at Simon and the worker. With a smile, the worker pointed to the skeletons at a pile of large trunks that the workers had cut down earlier. They looked at him carefully, and then at the trunks that were pointed out to them, and walked over to them. In a moment, they began to move them to the joyful applause of the worker, who was glad to be able to take a break. The worker was very grateful and thanked the foreman loudly. He replied that he had no problem with that, as long as the worker continued to work hard. Simon was proud of what a great necromancer his father was, that he could provide his workers with additional labor using skeletons. A small digression follows, which tells the story of necromancers. In this world, necromancers are special magicians who use black and dark magic. With its help, they can summon and revive long-dead creatures. Once upon a time, an emperor lived in this world who wanted to destroy necromancers so that they could not influence his empire in any way. He ruled the empire of Thalhern, and for this task he sent 50,000 soldiers. This army was called the Rose Brigade. The headquarters of the necromancers was in Kizen, and they knew what the emperor was planning against them, so 10 necromancers opposed the emperor's army. Only 10 necromancers, but all 50,000 soldiers of the Rose Brigade were destroyed and turned into the undead. Thus began the destruction of the empire. The destruction of the Rose Brigade eventually led to the surrender of the remnants of the Thalhern Empire. In order to take revenge on the arrogant emperor, necromancers turned him into the undead. And the emperor met his miserable end in the form of a rotting corpse, permanently sitting on the throne of the empire. Thus began a new era of necromancers' rule. They were able to conquer half of the entire continent without meeting any worthy resistance. But another force stopped and threatened the dominance of the necromancers, ruling the other half of the continent. These were the priests. The only antagonists of the necromancers who served and worshipped the goddess Devi. But for now, there was a fragile peace between the two opposing forces on the continent. But this did not apply to our domain, where the workers and the undead worked together. Under the watchful eye of their lord, who also liked the way they worked together. This was the town of Leshill. Here, too, humans and undead worked well together, and the power of necromancers was used for good. If you look at the map, it is barely visible, surrounded by large cities and castles. Not even all the neighboring villages knew about the existence of this town. Our main character's name is Simon. He is the heir to this property, and in the future he is to become its lord. He is still a very young and joyful boy, but his father was sure that he had a great future ahead of him. So, the Academy of Necromancers and a Genius Recruit. This is the title of our fascinating story, which I invite you to dive into. Simon returned home after helping his father. They had a small, but nice house for lords. His mother was already waiting for him at home and welcomed his return. Her name was Anna Valencia. Simon was also happy to see her and told her that he had just been helping with the logs. Simon walked over to the stove. His mother told him that he must be hungry by then, but to wait a little longer. He looked at what she was cooking and asked what it was. It was water infused with leharka mushrooms. They looked dangerous even at first glance. And Simon told his mother that they were poisonous, but she was not at all fazed and assured him that he should not worry about anything. She would make them edible with magic. And she began to use her bright light magic on her brew. Dazzled, Simon was shocked by the holiness of this magic. His mother was a former priest and her power fully proved it. Every time he saw her power, Simon wondered how his parents could have met if they were complete opposites. And he imagined his happy parents together. But his thoughts were interrupted by his mother's voice telling him to stop staring at those mushrooms. She asked him why he wasn't going to eat. Hungry, Simon could not disagree. He walked over to the table, which was filled with various tasty and fragrant dishes. They waited for his father to come and started eating together, but Simon ate very little, and his mother noticed. She asked if he was sick. While his father absorbed everything with incredible strength. In the afternoon, when Simon was about to go to his room, he noticed his mother making his father a cucumber face mask. And looking at them, he thought it was as if they were still on their honeymoon, they were so happy. In the evening of that wonderful day, Simon watched the full, beautiful moon from his room. And when he said good night to his parents and was about to close the door to his room, a letter suddenly flew in and stuck right to the face of the surprised Simon, who lost his balance from the surprise. He got up and peeled the letter away from his face, wondering what it was. And when he turned to the window, he noticed a girl sitting on it. She had appeared there as if with the rustling of leaves. And now she was greeting him with a smile on her face. Surprised, Simon was a little scared and could not say anything in response. He turned his back on her without answering, as if he had not seen anything. He thought it was a hallucination or a dream. So he decided to lie down on the bed and fall asleep. However, the girl was not going to give up and jumped into the room screaming. She was screaming at him not to pretend not to see her. But Simon just laid down on his bed and covered himself with a blanket, hoping that by ignoring her he could get rid of her. But the girl didn't give up. She said she knew he could see her. She began to pull off his blanket. She asked him to get up now. But none of them gave up, and each of them pulled the blanket in his own direction. Simon realized that they would not let go of him and exhaled tiredly. Then he sat down on the bed and asked who she was. How did she get here? Was she lost? The girl irritably assured him that she was not lost and that he was stupid. She said confidently that she was here to see him, Simon Valencius. She pointed her finger directly at him. He asked in surprise how she knew his name. And she started to explain about the letter, when bam! Simon's parents heard strange noises in his room and burst in. They asked what was going on. Wasn't it a burglar who broke into their house? Both of them in their pajamas, armed with a frying pan and a rolling pin, they looked rather funny or scary, but the girl who was already sitting on Simon's bed greeted them happily, calling them by name. She knew Richard and Anna. And they knew her. Her name was Naftis and she was very happy to see them. Amazed, Simon watched as his parents greeted this strange visitor with happiness. They noted that she had not changed at all and how much they missed her and she missed them. His parents told Simon to introduce himself with all due courtesy. This is the legendary Neftis Arkbold. And she began to look proudly at Simon. And then he began to remember everything he had been told. He looked at her with disbelief. Was it really Naftis Arkbold? No way. Are you sure it was Neftis Arkbold? She was the one who had made the emperor of the Thalhern Empire her dead puppet. Could she be the same witch of death who had lived for over 300 years? And she told him that yes, she was the very same Neftis Arkbold of Kizen. Excited, Simon began to understand what the letter that had come to him meant. Could it be the same one? And he began to open the letter. Naftis asked for permission to make him a formal proposal. With a trembling hand he began to take the letter out of the envelope. Opening it, he began to read. It was indeed an invitation. The letter informed him that he had been accepted to study at the Necromancer Academy in Kizen because of his great potential. After he read the letter, Nephthys extended her hand to him and invited him to come to Kizen. As she said goodbye, she told him that they would see each other in Kizen. And she was looking forward to seeing him there. And she disappeared into the moonlight. Simon was left to contemplate the breeze that picked up the leaves and the moonlight that filled everything around him. His father interrupted Simon's thoughts by asking to see the letter. He wanted to examine everything in detail because he was worried about his son, although he always knew that this day would come sooner or later. Simon couldn't help but agree, so he quickly gave the letter to his father. Richard began to read the letter aloud. But Simon interrupted him with a question. He asked his father what the letter meant when it referred to Kizen. His father began to explain to him that it was the center of the Dark Alliance and the headquarters of the necromancers. This place also serves as a school for the education of young necromancers. The chancellor of this school in Kizen is Nephthys, whom he had just seen. Simon asked incredulously, "Chancellor?" And his memory flashed back to her behavior when she was here, more like a child than an adult. Richard noticed the expression on his son's face and told him that she really didn't look like a chancellor, but that it didn't matter at all, because looks can be deceiving. Simon had so many questions. And he didn't know where to start. The first thing he asked was where was Kizen? Was it far from their home? His father, plunging into old memories, answered that it was really far away. Kizen is located on an island called Roke. And you can get there only by ship, which sails from Langerstein, the capital of the Kingdom of Dresden. Then, on that ship, you have to sail for quite a long time to reach the right island. However, his father assured him that he shouldn't worry, there were many interesting and fun things to do in Langerstein, and the island of Roke itself was an incredibly beautiful place. And Kizen is also known for its stylized uniforms worn by its residents. Surprised, Simon repeated, "Uniforms." Simon asked what was going to happen and how. His mother replied that this would keep him busy until the initiation ceremony began. His father assured him that there was still much to prepare and do to become a necromancer. He should study hard at school to gain the necessary skills. However, first they were going to open his core. The mother asked the father if he wanted to teach his son a little bit of black magic. The father was all for it and said he would be happy to teach him. He also told Simon that he should learn how to breathe properly, so he shouldn't expect to sleep until tomorrow. They had a lot to do. Joyful and confused at the same time, he did not even know what to say to his parents. He was breathless about the upcoming trip. After meeting with Nephthys that day, Simon began the busiest week of his life. There were so many things to prepare for Kizen. His mom and dad had nothing but good things to say about the school and convinced him that he would have fun there and would love it. But the sudden news of their son's departure worried them both. His father continued to teach him. He told him that some spells might hurt, but he had to be patient. And Simon endured all the pain and tried his best. For 3 days this week, he didn't sleep at all as he formed the core with his father's magic. After the grueling hours of core formation, he needed to spend the rest of the day learning breathing techniques and taking a crash course in black magic from his father. A week later, the boy, who had never left his native Les Hill and had spent his entire life here, set off on a journey. He was accompanied by all the servants and his mother. His father went with him. His mother had tears in her eyes and asked them to be careful. The servants were also very concerned about their masters and wished them a safe journey. That was the beginning of their departure to Kizen. They had already traveled some distance and the father continued his black magic lessons. He advised Simon to draw the magical power into his body, which surrounds him everywhere in the air around him. And slowly start to control the mana inside. After that, Simon had to move it through his core. It was as simple as that. His father wondered if he could feel the mana getting harder inside him. Simon did not answer, he was completely focused on the process. The blue energy began to surround him from all sides and it seemed that he was drawing energy from the environment into his core. His father advised him to direct the mana to flow through his hands. He did exactly what his father told him and he succeeded. Now he had to let the mana flow through his fingers. And streams of blue drops flowed down his fingers. Large blue drops seeped out at the tips of his fingers. His father praised him, he was a good boy and a quick learner. Now he knew the source of a necromancer's power. Darkness. Simon looked closely at the dark blue drop on his finger. His father went on to explain to him that the biggest difference between an ordinary magician and a necromancer is in the darkness. Mana has the property of being a gas, which makes it low density and prone to dispersion in the air. On the other hand, darkness is closer to solids or liquids. Therefore, it is easy to bind and change its shape. And he showed him on his hand. So if he uses the properties of darkness, he can shape it into a shape like this. And he showed him a miniature doll on his hand that looked like his mother with a frying pan and a spatula in her hands. Simon was fascinated by this skill. But his father continued to tell him that those who practice and improve their skills in controlling the power based on darkness are called necromancers. And he clenched his fist and smashed the icon he had created before. But since they didn't have a lot of time now, he suggested that Simon focus on the basics of mining the darkness into his core. Simon agreed with his father. And he began to gather the darkness on his hands. At first, it was just a few drops. But then, thanks to his diligence, he managed to form a whole puddle of darkness. Then he began to form something that looked like a hair from a distance, but his creation was shaking and too liquid. And as expected, in a moment his hair spread all over his hands, not holding its shape. His father watched his attempts with a smile. He thought to himself that he could not believe it. He was very impressed and surprised. It usually takes about 6 months to 2 years to learn how to form objects using darkness. But Simon moved in leaps and bounds and achieved it in just 3 days. After a few attempts, he was able to create a stable structure with flowers and a bird. His father, meanwhile, continued to reflect that he knew his son was talented, but he didn't think he was that talented. Such an incredible talent could have shot him in the back. He didn't put off helping him with the core until now, hoping that he wouldn't repeat his mistakes that he made in his youth. Many dark mistakes that he did not want to remember. But on reflection, he realized that it was time to let his talent explode. He hoped his son would do better than him and not make as many mistakes. In the meantime, Simon was busy making something. Then he showed his creation to his father. It was a dark blue fire. He said it was called a midnight glow, a very special kind of fire. His father thoughtfully remarked that his darkness was a beautiful shade of blue. Simon was very excited and asked his father if it was a good thing that his darkness was this midnight blue color. Is it a rare shade for necromancers? Did it make him talented? Or just smiled in response. And then he said that it was just a color and it didn't affect anything. At this news, Simon's hands dropped and his sparkle evaporated. Their carriage stopped with a squeak of wheels. And the driver of their carriage said that they had arrived. His father told him that not at all, this was just the border of the kingdom of Dresden. Here he had to leave it. Simon was saddened by this news, but just in case he asked what he meant. His father replied that he was sorry that he could not tell him the reason. But because of ancient events, he could not enter the territory of the kingdom of Dresden. It was a long time ago and it is a long story. The father began to instruct Simon that he should decide for himself and think before every action. Simon was very confused. Richard assured him that he shouldn't worry, he could guarantee him that he would cope with everything that awaited him better than anyone else. And he is really proud to have such a wonderful son. The father remained standing on the road, watching the carriage that was taking his son to a new life. He wished him good luck and safety on his journey as he saw the last outlines of the carriage in the distance. A week later, they were on the road to the kingdom of Dresden. Simon finally arrived in the capital, which looked like an ordinary city of the late Middle Ages. However, when he entered the city, it was clear that everything was not so simple. In the capital, in the crowd of people, there were no less skeletons, and perhaps even more. And skeletons not only of people, but also of other creatures. It was a beautiful city, Langerstein. One look at it took Simon's breath away. He had never seen such majestic buildings and lively crowds of people before. He realized that this city was very big and he should be on the lookout for trouble. As he walked through the crowd, he kept looking back nervously and clutching his leaflet with the address of his destination. It read, 239, Cammell Road, Langerstein. The conductor would be waiting for him. But this told him nothing at all. He didn't even know what street he was on. He decided to ask some of the people in the crowd. Simon noticed a beautiful girl in the crowd and approached her. He asked if he could ask her to help him. But when she turned to face him, it turned out that one of her eyeballs was just hanging on a muscle and dangling at the level of her chin. She politely asked how she could help. Simon was in a very uncomfortable position. He could barely stop himself from running away or pulling away from her, because that would be rude. Restraining himself and stammering, he managed to ask how he could get to the address written on the note. He handed her the note with trembling hands. She leaned over and looked at the note with her abnormal eyes. She made Simon hold back even more, and he was ready to run away. But she quickly replied that she knew where Camel Road was. And she pointed to a square up the street. He was to walk across the square, turn right, and there he would see a street covered with gilded tiles. This would be Camel Road, one of Langerston's famous landmarks. Simon was happy to hear that it was not far away. He politely thanked this strange young girl. She appreciated his behavior and called him a polite boy. She wished him safety and good luck with his business in Langerstein. Simon wished her the same and hurried to the square through the crowd. Simon did not notice it, but as soon as he got away from the lady, a man who was secretive and unnoticeable in the crowd approached her. He started asking her questions too. With all his charisma, he asked her for a favor. But Simon did not notice this and carefully reread his note again as he walked to the square. Meanwhile, the person who was supposed to meet Simon could not wait for him and asked herself why he was taking so long. She wondered if he might have gotten lost himself. Simon was in trouble. The man who had been chasing him turned out to be a common mugger who had spotted the rich newcomer as a gawker in town. And now Simon felt very sorry for letting his father down. He was in an alley with a whole gang of robbers, who were now ordering him to throw everything he had on the ground. His bag, his clothes, absolutely everything. They were laughing at such a foolish commoner who was so easy to deceive and trap. Simon thought that now he would probably have to arrive in Kizen later than expected. And now we fast forward an hour earlier to see how he got into such trouble. Simon was standing on Camel Road looking at the house numbers. Suddenly, someone approached him. A young man asked him if he was going to 239, Camel Road. Simon was excited, he thought it was the guide mentioned in the note. And the man confirmed it to him. He said that he was his guide. And he is here because he did not come on time to the address. He thought that his guest must be lost and so he started looking for him until he found him here. Simon shook the man's hand and told him that he was glad to meet him. He introduced himself and said his name was Simon Valencia. The man also introduced himself as Rowley, the Langerstein guide. This so-called guide invited him to follow him, he would lead him first to his accommodation. On the way, the guide told him that he was glad he found the boy before he got into trouble. There are so many bandits in this city trying to rip off inattentive tourists. This is when Simon started to have questions. Something was wrong here, and he knew what it was. Seeing his questioning expression, the guide clarified that he meant pickpockets, muggers, overpriced vendors, all those things. But Simon didn't let on, he was watching this pseudo-guide carefully. When they came to an alley, Simon said to this guide, "So that's why you're trying to rob me like this too?" The guide froze in his tracks, not expecting this turn. However, he quickly composed himself and quickly put a smile on his face. He casually replied that he didn't quite understand what the guy meant. Simon then began to explain to him that he was constantly looking down, and constantly holding his lower vest pocket to check if his thing was still with him, right? Then he went on to say that judging by the size of the pocket and the crease, it was a knife. The guide was very surprised by the boy's observation. He started to make excuses again, saying that it was all just for self-defense and that he had misunderstood. But it was already clear that his lie was falling apart. Finally, Simon pointed out to him that Howl was the name of a goat living in Loss Hill. Guide Rowley was terrified. The guide was shaking. He asked Simon why he followed him knowing all this. What kind of a madman is he? And he pulled his knife out of his pocket. This seemed to be a sign to his accomplices, who immediately surrounded Simon. Feeling the support of his accomplices, the pseudo-guide felt more confident. And swearing, he told Simon that in the end it didn't matter who he was. He would beg for mercy in front of all of them. Now he will put everything he has on the ground. His bag, his clothes, absolutely everything. Simon calmly refused, even though he was surrounded by robbers on all sides. Another of the robbers threatened him with a knife and told him that he was a guy from the village and did not quite see the whole picture. Simon made a quick movement and asked if it looked like he couldn't see anything now. The angry robber rushed at him with a knife and shouted that they would kill him right there. But Simon easily dodged his stab. And he calmly looked at the surprised robber, preparing for a counterattack. Then he quickly grabbed his wrist and squeezed it so that he dropped his knife to the ground. A loud crunch of broken bone followed, and the accomplices were frightened and shocked. Simon told them that sometimes he met people like them on his property. He was still holding the unfortunate thief's hand. He called them scum, mixing with good people and then ripping them off in the name of protection fees and other nonsense. And it was his duty as the heir to the Lord to cleanse and destroy all such filth as they were. And when they heard that he was a nobleman, they told him that this was even more reason why they would not let him leave. Their leader, Riley, shouted for everyone to come. And more robbers came out of the houses nearby. Simon thought that unfortunately he was going to have to stay here because of this trouble. Then a beautiful black-haired girl appeared in the alley, wearing gold earrings decorated with rubies. She said with relief that she had finally found him. She walked down the alley, clacking her high heels. Some of the bandits began to pay attention to her. But she was talking to Simon. She had been waiting for him for so long that she had to go look for him herself, since he hadn't shown up. Riley asked irritably, "What else?" The girl with black hair stopped holding one of the locks of her luxurious hair in her hand. She turned to Simon that it looked like he was dealing with some small annoying things at the moment. Riley replied to her not to worry, they were outnumbered and were going to deal with him quickly and get out of here. But the girl advised her to do her math. The wall of one of the houses nearby cracked and began to fall apart, scattering debris. With noise and cracking, bones began to break through the wall of stone and wood. The girl asked if they knew that this building was a skeleton shop. Dozens of skeletons began to emerge from the gap in the wall, banging their bones. The frightened bandits only managed to shout that it was a necromancer. But it was too late. One word from the girl and all the skeletons attacked the robbers. None of them could escape. They did not know mercy and did not pay any attention to the screams of these poor idiots. Riley was speechless at the sight of the skeleton. But the fear for his life overcame everything and he began to shout that he was very sorry that they did not recognize her, begging for mercy and mercy. The girl asked him what clan he belonged to. Riley replied that they were from the Claven clan. She was not impressed by his answer. Why, if he was from such a great clan, was he picking the pockets of a poor tourist? Let me go and explain to the clan leader myself. And then she ordered the skeleton holding him to put his head on the ground with both his hands behind his back, and then make him crawl on his face all the way to the city guard headquarters, where he would have to confess to them and turn himself in. Riley was still begging for mercy. The girl quietly whispered to him that she did not know what mercy was. Then, furiously, she asked if it was an order to her. Then she calmed down a bit and told everyone present that if he did something differently than she told him, or if his face was not wiped enough, she would know. And then his entire clan would be wiped off the face of the planet in the name of Kizen. The bandit asked for nothing more, only that he was sorry and would remember her words forever. Simon just watched this performance from behind the girl's back. When the skeletons dragged the robbers away, the girl turned to him and said that he must be Simon Valencia, right? He answered in the affirmative and immediately thanked her for her help with the robbers. But he still did not know her name or who she was. To which she replied with a smile that she was his true guide. She quickly grabbed his hand and pulled him along. On the way, she told him that her mother was waiting for them. Simon did not understand what her mother had to do with it. When they arrived, her mother was not there. And the girls started looking for her. She wondered where she could have gone again, since she had been told to wait here. Then her eyes fell on an ice cream cart and a girl with white hair next to it. A scream interrupted her as she was about to take the ice cream and was covered in it. The girl with black hair was annoyed and told her that she had told her to stay here. Why didn't she listen? She started to make excuses, saying that she was waiting. But her daughter didn't stop arguing, because she was always getting lost, so she should stop going everywhere alone. She started wiping her dirty face with a handkerchief. The girl's mother kept making excuses that she only went because there was an event with free ice cream samples to try and she couldn't resist. Her daughter replied to her, what if they had lost Simon because of that? What if she hadn't found Simon first, what would have happened to them? Simon watched this family quarrel and was shocked to find out that Nephthys was the girl's mother, not her younger sister, as he had first thought. In the background, Nephthys said that she was not sorry for her behavior, because everything was fine and they had not lost the student. Then, having ended their quarrel with nothing, Nephthys finally turned her attention to Simon. She told him that he was probably tired after the trip and she hoped he had learned something from his father. Simon replied that he had indeed learned something. And then he decided to show what he had learned and lit his midnight blue fire. The two girls stared at him in awe. Nephthys said that she had not seen such a shade of darkness for a long time. But it still had the properties of mana. Because this light was swirling like real fire, which meant that it was still in a gaseous state. She was also sure that he would learn to use his core more effectively. And they would definitely teach him that at school. So everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. Then Nephthys asked her daughter Lorraine to do something for her. She asked her to be a guide for the new student. And she assured her that she believed in her. Lorraine wasn't thrilled with the idea because her mother always left her with the heavy lifting. But for Nephthys, there was no such thing as a no, so she ran off merrily with the ice cream for more ice cream. Then Lorraine finally introduced herself officially to Simon. Her name was Lorraine Arbold and she was a student at Kizen like him. And she unceremoniously grabbed his hand again. She asked him if he was ready to go now. When he asked where they were going, Lorraine happily told him they were going shopping for the new semester at school. Simon, do you know what the most exciting moment of the entire school year was? Lorraine asked him. He didn't know, so he just asked what it was. She told him that it's when you buy your uniforms, notebooks, textbooks and other supplies before you get to school. This is the most exciting moment, so he should enjoy it. So they went to the bookstore together. Lorraine asked if he wanted to get his textbooks first. There was a very large selection, so she would help him. Simon was all for it because everything was new and different for him. At first Lorraine threw him one book and Simon thought it would be easy. But as soon as he picked it up, he almost dropped it. It was very heavy. He read the title on the cover. It was Introduction to Summonology by Elric Moore Trimble. As soon as he read the title, another book was already flying into his hands. A flurry of books flew at him, and he barely had time to cover himself with his hands, trying to shout to Lorraine. Simon was frightened by so many books, so he said he hoped he wouldn't have to study all these subjects in the first year. Lorraine reassured him that of course not. He has to take them all in the first semester of his freshman year. She told him not to be a crying baby and threw another book of toxicology at him. Beaten by books and surrounded by books, he sat on the floor. Lorraine, meanwhile, was about to go get the last book for him, Dynamics of Darkness. While she was gone, he had some time to himself, put his books in a pile and began to think. He had never met so many people his age. This made him only wait and dream about his future life at school. Then a girl with pink hair appeared in the background and started running fast. She was running somewhere and didn't notice Simon at all. Then she noticed him and looked right into his face. But because of this, she lost her balance and ran right into a shelf of books. And while she was screaming about her nose, which she hit, the shelf started to wobble and books started to fall right on top of her. But our hero reacted quickly and decided to cover her with his body. She just squinted her eyes helplessly. When everything calmed down, the girl began to apologize, convincing him that it was her fault and that she was fine. Simon told her that everything was fine and that he was partly to blame, as he was standing in her way and distracted her. Then he asked her if she was okay, if she could help him pick up all these scattered books. Otherwise, if they didn't, they might get yelled at. She gladly agreed. While they were picking up the books, they started a conversation and she asked if he was also a new student at Kizen. Simon confirmed her guess. Then she happily introduced herself, saying that her name was Cindy Vivaci and she was a new student. She asked what his name was. He introduced himself as Simon Valencia. She was very pleased to meet him. Cindy told him that she was from a remote town in the north, so she didn't have any close friends here yet. Simon assured her that she was not alone, and they were in this boat together, because he had no friends yet either. Cindy's eyes lit up. She could not believe her ears. Then she asked if it would be okay for him if. And she stopped in mid-sentence. Finally, she made up her mind and asked if she could say hello to him at school. Simon happily replied that of course he would. He was going to ask her the same thing. When they finished putting their books away, Sandy said she had to run because her father was waiting for her. Simon assured her that he would be waiting to meet her at school. And when she was about to leave, Simon asked her to wait. He asked her if she would mind returning his wallet. She was caught and surprised, but it didn't upset her at all. Cindy began to make excuses. She thought she wouldn't get caught because she had used spiritual magic to steal the wallet. She wondered how he had noticed. Simon began to explain that he had noticed his wallet flying out of his pocket along with the books falling down. Cindy wondered how he could have just noticed that. He must be playing a trick on her. She asked if he was going to become a master in spiritualism as well. Simon replied that he hadn't decided yet. Then Cindy poked him right in the chest with her finger and assured him that she knew it. Kizen is on a whole other level. She can't believe it. Kizen must be full of kids like him. She can't wait any longer to start school. Simon, on the other hand, was worried about something else entirely. Why is she so shameless, pickpocketing and looking so cute at the same time? Cindy was jumping for joy. She was so excited about the possibility of going to school with Simon and seeing him for 3 years. She suggested that they compete to see who would be the best when the time came. And she finally gave him back his wallet. Cindy assured him that she was looking forward to seeing him at school and that she hoped he wouldn't be a stranger when he met her there. And she just walked through the bookshelf with her magic. Then Lorraine finally returned. She informed him that the store did not have Introduction to Dark Dynamics in stock right now, but as soon as it did they would deliver it along with his other books to his dorm. Simon was completely satisfied with this option, but his mind was on something else. Lorraine also asked him who the girl was and if he had already made friends with her. Simon answered with some hesitation that he had. But Lorraine completely misunderstood his uncertainty and winked and assured him that he shouldn't be so embarrassed. He could be honest with her, and she could tell him if he liked the girl or not. Simon just thought to himself that she had almost stolen his wallet. So he just didn't show any emotion and Lorraine lost interest in the conversation. Then Lorraine said they had to go. They had already found all the books they needed and it was time to put them all in a bag. Simon looked at his bag and at the huge pile of books. And he had questions. Lorraine saw his look and understood. Not the bag he had. It was a different bag, a bag used by necromancers. It's called a magical inventory, and to put it in simpler terms, necromancers call it subspace. Simon was fascinated by such an amazing thing. They went to another store, where they were greeted by a nice elderly lady, who probably owned the store. She knew that Lorraine had recently purchased a special bag for herself, which meant that it was time to find a bag for this gentleman. Lorraine confirmed her guess, but added that he was a beginner, so he should choose a bag with the fewest restrictions. When the saleswoman approached the display case, Lorraine read an inscription on one of the rings that were actually magic bags. You don't need walls or floors to use subspace, often we fight on the open plain when it comes to the real battle. To which the store owner replied that she has great eyesight and taste. And if it is a special case, she can show a prototype that has not yet been released to the mass market. She would make an exception just for them. And she held out this special ring to Simon. He immediately put it on. Lorraine told him that he should feel the darkness flowing through him into this ring. Then he should feel something like a touch. And Simon felt it as if he had touched a handle or a lever. Then Lorraine told him to pull and imagine it was a lever. And when he pulled it, a huge rectangular hole appeared on the floor. The salesperson explained to them that this was the latest product from Gelen Eclipse, a young master craftsman of the next generation. This subspace can withstand a load of up to 4,000 pounds. And it can open on any surface, even on slopes and uneven surfaces. The subspace itself is enchanted with 7 spells, including level 1 preservation and temperature control. And more importantly, using this bag activates invisibility to hide your location from enemies. Lorraine asked about the function of releasing the contents. And she was told that it was also included. Simon was delighted. Lorraine asked if he liked it and Simon said that he was thrilled, but he wasn't sure if he could afford it. This bag must be very expensive. Lorraine didn't understand his question. Maybe? And she loudly asked the saleswoman Stephanie how much it cost. She answered 5,000 gold coins. Simon's jaw dropped at the price. It was the amount of Lascelles' budget for several years. But Lorraine didn't seem to be embarrassed by this amount of money. She said she would take it. Simon was shocked that she was going to buy it for him. But Lorraine told him that he had nothing to worry about, it was not her money, it was her mother's. Lorraine then explained to him that she didn't know all the details, but that Naftis owed Simon's parents a lot of money. And so it's like she's returning the favor. So he shouldn't turn down the offer. But Simon knew that this was a big gift for him. How could he ever repay Neftis? Lorraine advised him not to even think about it. If he wanted to repay her mother, he should just study hard and behave well at Kizen. Simon was sure that he would try his best and do his best. And they left the store together, thanking him for his services. Now that they had everything they needed, they could have some fun. Lorraine was very insistent on it, but Simon was not sure. But Lorraine assured him that it was part of their routine and dragged him along. She took him to a shooting range where toy skulls of skeletons wearing helmets were lined up in several rows. Lorraine put a crossbow in Simon's hands and told him to shoot at the stuffed skulls. He started to try, and as it turned out he was very good at it. It was evening, and as they walked up one of the streets of the city, Lorraine said it was the highest point in the city. Around them were many couples lighting flying lanterns. They also lit one and sent it flying. Lorraine said that this city is one of the most popular among tourists and is called the Square of 1,000 Lanterns. She asked him what he thought. Simon simply replied that he wondered if there were really thousands of fools here who wanted to spend 200 silver coins on a piece of flammable, oily paper. Lorraine, after this answer, said that he would be successful in Kizen. Simon thought it was a compliment and thanked her. But it turned out that it wasn't. And Simon continued to stare at the lights in the sky, a little embarrassed. Then they went to dinner. They chose a nice place on the waterfront. And as they began to eat, Lorraine noticed something. Simon's manners were very different from hers. She asked if he really came from a noble family. Simon replied that his father was very strict about etiquette. Lorraine noticed that he had learned well from his parents. But he should know that 30% of the population of Kizen are ordinary people. Therefore, he should not show his superiority over them by using his status. She started to explain to him that in Kizen there is a strict system based on merit, not on origin. Simon promised to remember that. Lorraine also asked him if he had any more questions, since tomorrow was his first day at school. And he remembered that girl, Cindy, whom he had met in the bookstore. She said something about majors. Lorraine beamed. Majors, a tough question for a newcomer. She began to explain that he would have 9 courses in the first semester of freshman year. 7 majors and 2 minors. From the second semester, he will be able to choose his own electives. And when he reaches the 2nd grade, he will have to declare what specialty he chooses. He asked how the girl he was dating was doing. Lorraine said yes. Then Simon realized that this meant he had to quickly figure out what subjects he was good at. And choose one of them. Lorraine supported him that he was absolutely right, and that she advised him to focus on his core courses and put all his energy into studying them. Also, students with clear strengths are more popular among students when it comes to group homework. Simon's imagination was unstoppable. And he definitely remembered this advice. Lorraine asked him if he had any ideas about what specialty he would like to choose. He replied that he was interested in summonology, a little bit. Simon was grateful to Lorraine for helping him with the bandits and was impressed with her skills. Lorraine appreciated his potential choice. She also thought that summonology was great. This science is imbued with the mood of orthodox magic. She also began to tell him about the professors at Kizen, one of whom was the legendary Professor Hongpeng. Lorraine shared that she is still sometimes in awe when she meets him. As well as other famous professors. Simon was excited and wanted to meet them in person as soon as possible. Their dinner passed quickly and unnoticed behind the conversation. Lorraine took Simon to his hotel and wished him a good rest. Because if he was late tomorrow and tired from walking with her today, her mother would beat her to death. Simon thanked her for the wonderful evening. He didn't think he would ever forget this day for the rest of his life. Lorraine was very happy to hear him say that. She was about to leave and say goodbye to him when she suddenly remembered something and stopped. There was actually something she had to tell him. She wasn't going to deceive him or anything. But for some reason she hadn't found the right time to tell him that she would also be a new student at the school. Simon was shocked and couldn't say anything. So Lorraine continued that she hoped they would be friends when they met each other at school. Simon almost lost his bag. And she definitely said goodbye to him, leaving him with a lot of unanswered questions. The next morning, Simon came to the port where their ship was supposed to be. He was amazed at how many things were around him, but most of all he was impressed by the passengers. Everyone had their own unique style. He thought that they made him seem the most ordinary person here. But when he heard that the ship to Kizen was leaving soon, he quickly hurried to get there. Lorraine had told him yesterday that she would be taking a different route to the island, so the next time they would see each other would be at school. Simon handed his ticket to the ticket taker. And while he was checking his ticket, Simon began to look around the ship. It was big and beautiful, but it was moored with its bow to the shore, whereas they usually did the opposite. Meanwhile, the ticket taker confirmed that his ticket was fine and he could go through. Simon thanked him. But before he could get on the ship, a noise distracted him. Someone was yelling and proving to someone that something was wrong. It was another young man shouting at another ticket taker at another entrance to the ship. He was arguing that he was number one on the waiting list, and how could it be that no one gave him an invitation? Is this how they do things in Kizen? The guy was very angry and started clenching his fists. He was shouting to get in touch with Casanova, because it was some kind of mistake. Someone standing next to Simon said that this happens every year. There are always kids like this one who can't accept the results. But still, he is number one on the waiting list and he must be very sorry. The boy did not calm down. He shouted that he was Lucius Carroll, heir to a county in the Kingdom of Dresden. He demanded to contact the headquarters, and that was an order. The ticket taker asked him to leave because he was not on the list of accepted students. Lucius' teeth clenched at this statement. He was furious. He grabbed the poor ticket taker by the hair and was about to hit him, saying how dare he. But someone grabbed his arm. Simon smiled at him and asked him to stop. Lucius screamed, "Who is he? Let him go right now." Simon looked at him with a murderous look and squeezed his arm hard, making it crackle. Lucius screamed in pain. He turned to Simon, saying that he must be looking for an easy death if he dared to do such a thing. But someone was already rushing to them, asking what was going on. A gray-haired man in a strict suit was walking toward them, tapping his cane. It was Professor Siage. Their quarrel immediately stopped and everyone looked at the professor. He asked Lucius if he had any last words. He quickly stood up and began to ask him to contact Nephthys urgently. The professor knew that he was first on the waiting list, but he also knew the result of his application and that he was not selected. And the professor was about to snap his fingers with an expressionless face. And he snapped them, asking Lucius if he thought he could get away with that kind of behavior. And blood spurted from the poor fool. After that, leaving him in a pool of blood, the professor said that they didn't have time and all students should get on board. And then he personally addressed Simon, saying that he should also get on board. He couldn't help but agree. Professor Siage was the first aboard, while the students began to whisper that it was bloody black magic. They wondered if the first graders could also take the class. Simon felt sorry for this poor proud fool. He wondered if he was still alive. Then the professor turned around, adjusting his hat, and told him not to worry, Lucius was still breathing. And when everyone got on board, the gangway creaked open by itself. All the students were on board and the professor personally checked their presence. After that, he asked everyone to sit and not get up. The professor was preparing a spell. The students looked at him in awe. He explained that the ship might go through turbulence during the journey, so he asked them to sit until his next announcement. Simon sat down and wondered how this ship would make it to Kizen. He couldn't see what was happening outside. The professor used his spell to surround the ship with a magical barrier. Simon thought that they would need to reverse somehow to be able to sail out to sea. The professor said to keep going. All the students heard something plop into the water. Someone suggested that it was just a big wave hitting the ship. But he was told that the sound was too loud. And then a huge whale jumped out of the water, right above the ship. Everyone was shocked. Where did the whale come from? They thought it was about to crush them. But the whale opened its mouth wide as it flew down on the ship. And it completely swallowed the ship with the frightened students inside. This giant whale was an underwater undead creature that obeyed Kizen's orders. It was a whale from the underworld. And if you look closely, you can see that it is a huge skeleton with a shell. It had a large amount of debris and other garbage in its stomach. The students wondered if they were inside the whale. And it seemed so. It was a monster that traveled the oceans around the world and attacked any port that Kizen pointed out to it. And only once a year. It transports the new students of Kizen to school. He was the high-speed transportation of Kizen. Their ship docked at a floating island. And all the students were surprised how nice it was, especially considering that they were inside a stomach. It seemed as if people lived here too. One guy came up to Simon. He told him that he was good and did a great job. Simon didn't understand what he was talking about. Then he explained that he was talking about the incident at the port, which was not a comfortable situation, but he was impressed with the way Simon had handled it. Simon replied that it was nothing special. The guy was delighted that Simon was also humble. He finally introduced himself. He was also a new student and his name was Rowan. Simon also introduced himself in return. And then a question from Rowan took him by surprise. He asked what kind of entrance exam he had. Simon didn't know what to say. But Rowan insisted. He began to tell him about his exam, how he made the darkness change shape. Simon thought that he hadn't taken any exam, that Nephthys had just come and given him an invitation letter to study and that was it. What if he got in trouble if he told the truth? So when Rowan asked what kind of exam he had, Simon lied and said that he had the same exam with the change in the shape of the darkness. Rowan was happy about this coincidence. An official announcement was made over the loudspeakers above them, calling for all students to return to the ship. They were almost at their destination. Simon could not believe it was so soon. As they climbed onto the ship, Simon noticed something strange. The water around them began to get more violent. All the students went down into the hold, but the professor stayed on deck. The waves were getting bigger every minute. The professor again created a barrier around their ship when the waves almost hit the deck. The students had been warned that it would be a little bumpy before they arrived, so they held on tight to their seats. They were told not to get up under any circumstances. Meanwhile, their ship was being tossed around like a ball with other debris on the waves. Almost all the students with their suitcases were in the air. They were all asked to hold on to the railings to avoid injury. And to be ready for any push. Simon could barely hold on to his seat. Then there was a thud and a blinding flash that blinded him. Their ship popped out like a cork from a bottle and they could see the whole island from above. It was a very breathtaking view. Simon stared mesmerized out the window while his new friend flew in the background all over the hold. Professor Siyaj clicked his rallying points, mentally controlling the magic barrier. And the ship began to rapidly approach the ground. Thanks to the barrier, the ship didn't fall as fast as it would have under gravity, but it was still fast enough. Eventually, the ship hit the water with a loud crash, but thanks to the barrier, it remained intact. It docked at the pier and the students were informed that they had arrived in Kizen. The students all approached the metal gate with guards. There they were told to line up in lines of 4. When they were done, they were given uniforms. They were each given a uniform and told that the locker rooms for girls and boys were separate. For boys on the right, for girls on the left. They were given 5 minutes to change, and then they were waiting outside. Simon looked with delight at his new uniform. Simon quickly put it on and began to look at himself in the mirror. He liked the way he looked. The uniform was stylized, just as his father had said, so he could wear it even to formal banquets. Meanwhile, the other students were discussing the properties of this uniform, and it turned out that it had a magic spell on it that made it stronger than ordinary armor in battle. They were being urged outside. They had to hurry. The guys started to come out of their locker room. All of them were kind of crumpled up. They were staring at the girls coming out from the other side, fascinated. It seemed that their uniforms were much better than theirs. Then they were going to be taken to the main auditorium. And as soon as Simon relaxed a bit, Rowan ran up behind him and started shouting at him that he looked great. And without restraint, he began to rejoice that he was finally in Kizen, asking him if this was really happening. He couldn't believe it. Everyone around him looked at him as if he was a weirdo who they felt sorry for. Simon just answered quietly and confusedly, telling him not to worry, that everything was real. After a while, Simon asked him if all these people were new students. There seemed to be a lot of them. Rowan assured him that of course, there were only 1,000 first-year students. Simon's jaw dropped in amazement. 1,000? But as Rowan knew, in the second grade, the number dropped to 300, and in the third grade, there were less than 150. Simon was shocked by this strict selection. For him, it meant that out of 1,000 students, only 30% of the best would be able to get into the second grade. That's how fierce the competition was. And there are already several of them worth watching. For example, there is Sir Nine Dark. Rowan pointed to a beautiful girl with blonde hair. She was the official heir to the Ivory Tower. And also other rising stars, all here. There's that one, Darwin Carradine, and then there's Jay Sanders. And also. But they heard a whisper from the front row. And Simon asked, who is this giant guy? He was really big. He was blocking the stage for everyone sitting behind him. But Rowan knew him, too. Châtelmaire was the name of this guy. And he was a semi-giant. Most likely he was a specialist in magic combat. No one could have beaten such a huge psycho. Then Rowan pointed him across the hall to a girl who was definitely the most capable in the entire class. It was Lorraine Archbold. She was an acquaintance of Simon's. Everyone thought she had been admitted on a special basis because she was the only daughter of Nephthys, but Rowan had heard that she had taken the entrance exam and passed with flying colors. She wasn't listed as the first or second student to take the test, but everyone already knew she was the best student in the class. One of the teachers took the stage. He asked for the students' attention and announced the beginning of the ceremony. The professor congratulated all the new students on their enrollment. And as a proud Kizen participant, he continued his speech inspiring students to study. And finally, he expected the students to do their best. They also warned them to be very careful and not to go to the local forest. Next, they were going to introduce the professors who would teach them in the first class. All of them were legendary masters in their field of necromancy. Rowan could not help but exclaim with joy that he had seen them all in magazines. They were introduced to Professor Bakil. He smiled and waved to everyone. The other professor in the background seemed to be very tired of these ceremonies. Simon applauded the professors who were introduced to him. But he noticed to himself that Nephthys was not there. Surely such a distinguished chancellor was not going to come to this boring ceremony for newcomers. It would be an honor to meet her even in the third grade. Is it really true? The host continued to lead the ceremony. Then he announced that the student representatives would now take the oath of office. All the students had to stand up from their seats. When they stood up, Simon asked Rowan if this was the final part of the ceremony. He replied that it was. The top two students, a male and female student, would come up and take the oath. Simon was curious who they could be. The presenter continued that the students whose names he called would come to the podium. The second best student was Sir Nine Dark. And she walked up to the podium to the admiring gazes of the students. And then the number one best student was Simon Valencia. He did not even realize at first that his name had been called. The huge hall was silent. The host asked if Simon Valencia was even here. And then the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. What? Simon finally got up from his seat and walked to the stage to the whispers of students who did not understand who he was and why he was the number one student. They all looked at each other. He stood next to Sir Nine Dark, sweating with excitement. But then he decided to pull himself together, to stop being nervous and just read what he was told. Together with Cern, they raised their hands and began to recite the oath. After they said the oath, he went back to his seat and began to think. It was true when he was told that Kizen was a very intense school, he could never have imagined that they would keep the whole class together all day for the initiation ceremony. There were 14 groups with more than 1,000 new students and every group was full. After everyone found out that he was number one among the freshmen, everyone started whispering about him. No one had ever heard of him before, and no one had ever heard of his family with the last name Valencia either. Simon was very tense because of this. Simon started his first day of school very stressed. He was on pins and needles about how many lessons he had to have. It was a good thing he had written down his schedule in his notebook. Looking through it, he settled on summonology, which was the class he wanted to take the most. Because it was the type of magic his father had used. This meant that he would be able to be like his father if he took this course. But Simon's first lesson was on catarology, and it began with the students rattling their pens and writing down the teacher's introduction. The professor paced from side to side and said that some people associate necromancers with dark and gloomy images of handling corpses in the dark. But all this is in the past. Modern necromancers are smart, practical, with a sense of style and trends. This is the new generation of necromancers, and this is how Bahil Amagar, a professor of catarology, started his career. He was a young star necromancer, a member of the Crow's Kizen's core battling group in his late 20s, and an idol of unrivaled popularity among Kizen students. He greeted everyone and explained that he would be teaching them catarology this year. The students were delighted and began to applaud him. He was a legend to them. Professor Bahil decided to start his class by checking attendance, and since they were probably seeing each other for the first time, he asked everyone to briefly introduce themselves when he called their name. And he called the first name Jamie Victoria, and a girl with green hair and glasses jumped out from behind the first desk raising her hand. She shouted that she was present and it was a great honor for her to meet him. She was going to become a specialist in catarology, following in the footsteps of the professor. But the professor stopped her with a wave of his hand. He advised her to introduce herself to her classmates, not to him, so let her try again. Jamie Victoria tried again, this time introducing herself to the students. Eventually it was to Simon's turn, but as soon as he said his name and where he was from, everyone started whispering about him again. After him, another guy named Hector Moore introduced himself. When everyone had finished introducing themselves, the professor noticed that they were all full of charm, but they should start their lesson. He began to draw a fundamental question on the board with chalk. Why should they study catarology? And he broke the chalk on the board. He asked all the students in the classroom if any of them could say the definition of catarology as a subject, and Jamie Victoria immediately jumped up from her seat with her hand raised. She said quickly and memorized that it is a type of dark magic that retains its power by weakening the enemy. The professor praised her answer. But he noted that some of the students would not quite understand what he was talking about, so he would rather just say that catarology is about weakening the opponent. Then he started drawing them an example on the board. And then he continued, let's say that there are two knights with approximately the same skill level. They start to fight vigorously with swords. They try to tire each other out and wait for the opponent to make a mistake. They exchange about 20 blows, but neither of them gives up. Simon listens to the story with fascination. However, one knight starts shouting loudly at the other and looking at him with a murderous look. His opponent is frightened, trembling and turning pale with fear. Finally, the knight's sword cuts the opponent's shoulder. He begins to bleed and his movements slow down and shake. The other knight realizes that this is his chance to win. He corners the enemy and attacks his leg to make him unable to move. Then he throws sand in his eyes and hits him on the head to distract him and keep him off balance. The battle is getting tense and finally, the knight finally cuts off his opponent's head, which falls to the ground. The professor has put the final point in his scheme. He asked the students whether they now see that even the most primitive and barbaric battles with cold steel are simply a series of actions that weaken the opponent in order to gradually achieve victory. The students were delighted with how the professor was able to explain a complex term in an interesting way. Now he was going to show them how modern necromancers fight. Professor Bahil began to draw on the board again. He depicted a conventional person, and then voiced his rhetorical question, how a modern necromancer would defeat this person. And he began to move the chalk quickly across the board. Then he hit the chalk against the board, death by curse after the first movement. And the necromancer won. The students were delighted, but did not quite understand what had happened. The professor began to explain that a curse is the lightest and simplest structure among all types of dark magic, and its other characteristic is that it is quickly activated. Moreover, it is effective as a low effort, allowing you to completely shake and confuse your opponent. The professor took a few steps and came close to the boy's desk with a smile. He continued to look at him smiling for several seconds. The boy did not understand what was happening and smiled nervously back. At the same time, unbeknownst to him, the professor was cursing him. And in a moment, this student fell helplessly on his desk with a dull thud. The professor took the and made a pretense of swinging. He said that this is how modern necromancers fight, and he pulled the knife towards the student and then put it away. All the students were delighted with the performance, except for that student. They shouted that it was so cool and that catarology was the best. The professor lifted his curse on that poor student with one snap of his fingers and continued his speech that he didn't want to know what subject they would choose to specialize in, but he dared to guess that more than 80% of them would choose his subject for the second semester. Simon was also excited about this class. He believed that catarology had the best compatibility with other subjects. The professor concluded his class by urging them to practice their specializations, but not to forget to curse their opponents whenever they have the opportunity. This will be the most effective way to win. He personally believes that catarology is the core of modern necromancy. The reason for this was that, having stopped, the teacher turned around and looked at the class, which was listening attentively to him and taking notes. Then with a sharp movement he revealed to the whole class the inscription he had written. Priests, this inscription was on the board, and that is why catarology was the most effective way of confronting their main enemies, with a serious voice explained the teacher, looking carefully at the class. Then turning to the students, some of whom looked at him with confusion, he asked them if necromancers had curses and priests had blessings. The difference was that one strengthened the target while the other weakened it. The question was to see when a curse was better than a blessing. The green-haired girl with glasses, who had been introduced earlier, jumped up from her seat, raising her hand in the air and calling her name again. Then she answered the question posed earlier by the professor, explaining that curses were quicker than blessings, which meant that curses could accumulate a weakening effect on the target faster, which was a huge advantage in real combat. Hearing the girl's answer, the teacher rubbed his chin thoughtfully, saying that it was an interesting opinion, but then added that it was wrong. The girl who answered froze in place with a raised hand and a bewildered look on her face. Seeing that no one else was willing to answer, the teacher began his explanations, beginning with the fact that if you consider only the speed of application, the scientists come to a consensus that the curses that are imposed through the resistance of the enemy, a little slower than the blessing of the priest. After finishing his explanation, the teacher asked if anyone had anything to add, and immediately a hand went up. The guy who raised his hand introduced himself as Hector Moore. Turning to the instructor, he replied that there was almost no one who trained in a weakened state. Intrigued by the boy's answer, the instructor looked at him with interest and then asked him to state his name again. After the yellow-haired boy repeated his name, the professor said that he would remember it, to which he sat down in his seat to the applause of the class. The professor continued the lecture, explaining that Hector's words were correct, because weakening spells really can't be blocked by training. Then the professor continued, saying that everyone when practicing is conditioned while in a normal state, and the measure of skills depends on how much and how well a person will train. It is also important to take into account all environmental factors and whether they are under our control. Raising his index finger up, the instructor emphasized that humans were more sensitive creatures than they appeared and could break even at the slightest change. In other words, you didn't need to take your entire arm away from an archer who was targeting you for victory. You just had to load his vision with conjunctivitis, make him nauseous and vomit, confuse his sense of distance and blur his vision, or simply divert his attention to another object while he escaped. With such simple and uncomplicated solutions, you could avoid the arrow flying at you, the teacher summarized. Then turning to the blackboard where the diagram was drawn, he said that necromancers have many ways to disrupt the state of the enemy. He then gave an example, saying that no one would practice to prepare for curses when they had a stomach ache or were tired. The instructor continued by saying that they could just take the day off. Hearing his words, the class chuckled. After waiting for the class to calm down, the teacher said that they should remember one important thing. And that was that they should think how to weaken others instead of thinking how to strengthen themselves, because the best defense is offense. The door opened, and 3 female assistants entered the classroom carrying boxes with the academy's emblem on them. After everyone had a set of what they would need for training, the teacher announced in a solemn voice that they would now have to learn how to cast curses on others. Simon, as you can see, was easily dumbfounded, because he couldn't believe they were learning dark magic in their first class. The teacher reminded the class that it should be a shame if a Kizen student used a proofreader, but made an allowance since it was the first class and also the first lesson. For Simon it was a shot in the eye, not in the eyebrow, because he was the one who used the corrector. The reason why the teacher didn't want the students to use it was because it was quite useful in mastering, but there was a risk of becoming addicted to it, so one had to be careful. Finished with the theory, the teacher clapped his hands and then turned to the class saying that now it was time to practice the curse of exhaustion. He then began to explain that the students had to hold on to the handles of the corrective device and squeeze their darkness into the pattern shape of the corrective device. He further explained that the key to successfully forming the perfect magic circle was the rune word, which was a set of letters possessing magical power. After that, the teacher raised his hand on which appeared a dark magical sign, around which there were many magical letters. After showing an example, he explained that writing the words of the rune with darkness causes magic. Seeing that everyone had finished creating magic circles, the teacher told everyone to raise them up. On top of the pattern of the magic circle that was on the device appeared another magic circle consisting of darkness. Simon was delighted to see this, as he had succeeded the first time. However, to Simon's surprise and incomprehension, the class was filled with cheers of students who managed to fulfill the teacher's task. In addition, his magic circle looked much more unreliable than the others and threatened to collapse at any second. Which happened in the next moment. Noticing Simon's failure, the teacher explained that this happens if you don't refine the darkness properly or loosen the binding of the magic circle, and then he ordered the boy to try again, to which he nodded in response. Walking up the steps of the classroom, the instructor said that those who could keep the magic circle in the air would move on to actual practice. He added that everyone had to have a plant that was given with the corrective device. Simon went on to create a stable magic circle. To the students who succeeded, the teacher told them to aim at the plant on the table. Then use the curse on the poor plant that was just beginning to enjoy life. To the students who succeeded, the plant shriveled up and took on a sickly appearance. In the next second the plant dramatically fell on its back with its arms spread out, ending its not long but very useful life, which will serve for the formation of a new generation of necromancers. The teacher explained that if the plant had noticeable changes, it meant that the magic circle was working properly. The golden-haired boy saw that the plant had taken a lying position and did not look healthy at all and exclaimed joyfully. The teacher noted that he was beginning to see the difference in skills between the students. At the same time Simon once again tried to stabilize the magic circle, which despite all his attempts did not become more stable. The teacher did not pay attention to Simon, who failed to create a magic circle, turned to the other students, saying that if they succeeded, they should repeat it to practice the speed of creating a magic circle. Simon failed at creating a circle once again. He clutched the knobs of the corrective device in frustration. He couldn't understand what his problem was, and why he was the only one failing. The other students, having successfully completed the first step, began casting the curse on the plants. Simon could not help but wonder what he was doing wrong. But suddenly a phrase he had heard before popped into his head. When Lorraine and Nephthys looked at the cloud of darkness that had formed on his arm, they were amazed to see that it also had the properties of mana, and that it was swirling like a flame, which meant that it was in a vaporous state. Nephthys added that this was why he was entering the academy, to learn how to use his core. Realizing that what Lorraine and Nephthys had said about him being very bad at operating mana was absolutely true. Simon decided to start with the basics in order to move from where he was stuck. Putting the device aside, he set his thoughts aside and concentrated only on the task at hand. Remembering Professor Bahil's words that the problem was either a lack of purification or a binding to the circle, he decided instead of sending the mana directly to the core, he would collect it as much as he needed. Then would send all the collected mana into the core at one time. Now that there was enough mana in the core, and his darkness was much stronger, all Simon had to do. So it was to pour his darkness back into the device and create a magic circle. As expected, it worked now, and the guy managed to form a perfect circle, which he immediately directed at the innocent plant, which had already given up hope that the guy would succeed. Fully prepared, Simon shouted a curse and activated the magic circle. He cast the curse on the plant, which immediately became painful and covered with a dark aura. Then he looked at his abuser one last time with resentment and tears in his eyes. The plant dramatically passed away. Simon couldn't be happy that he had finally succeeded, though not the first time. There was a man in the middle of the class who had been watching Simon closely all this time. Hector had been praised by the teacher and was one of the first to do the task. When he saw Simon's success, he clucked his tongue in annoyance. Clapping his hands to get the students' attention, the teacher said that that was all that applied to practice. As for those who failed, they would have to practice after they returned to the dormitories. Hearing the teacher's words, Simon breathed a sigh of relief as he was still able to complete the assignment. even though it was not the first time. However, Professor Bahil continued, saying that now they had to show what they had learned in this lesson. The teacher's words took Simon by surprise. The next moment the teacher noted with surprise that special admission number 1 was in this class. Then calling the name of the main character, he asked him to come forward. The eyes of the whole class were immediately directed at Simon, who, feeling uncomfortable, hesitantly agreed. The students, hearing that he was a special admission student, speculated about how good he would be. Professor Bahil decided that a special admission student needed a worthy opponent, so he decided to choose one from the students who had passed the entrance exam with impressive results. Calling Hector Moore's name, he asked him to step forward. Simon stood in the middle of the class opposite his tall and confident opponent and listened to the rules explained by the teacher. Simon and Hector were given corrective devices, and then Professor Bahil explained that they were only allowed to use the curse of exhaustion. The task was to create a magic circle and use it on the enemy. The first one to fail to stay on their feet. After hearing the rules, Hector raised his hand, saying that he would compete without the corrective device. The professor nodded his head and praised him, saying that such an attitude was welcome. Looking at the boy, who was staring at his opponent with drained confidence, Professor Bahil noted to himself that he seemed quite intelligent for his weak bare form. Remembering his words about using the device being undesirable, he noted that the boy had remembered that and decided to impress him by demonstrating his skills. Turning to Simon, he asked if he was going to use the corrective device, to which he replied in an uncertain voice that he was. With a disdainful look at the protagonist, the professor said yes. The next moment, with a smile on his face, he raised his hand, saying that they could start as soon as he gave the command and also wishing them good luck. There was silence between Simon and Hector. Hector frowned at Simon, while the latter didn't feel very confident against such an experienced and formidable opponent. In the next second, Professor Bahil gave the command to start the contest. Holding the corrective device in his hands and beginning to release the darkness into her, he calmed himself, telling himself not to be nervous and just do it like last time. Assuring himself that if he tried hard enough he could do it. Suddenly, however, previously unknown horrible feeling enveloped him. With a blurry look at his opponent, Simon couldn't believe his eyes. Hector freely steered the circle with one hand and pointed it at Simon. The students were surprised and praised how Hector was able to create a circle so quickly without a device. The boy held the circle in one hand and looked at the hall with a satisfied face. Simon didn't know what to do, as not only was he creating a circle slower than his opponent even with the device, but the mere hitting of his opponent made him feel very tired. Deciding not to wonder, Simon raised the device in front of him and resumed creating the circle. However, just like last time, his circle was very unstable and began to collapse. He decided that such a circle would be useless even if he managed to use it on his opponent, and having destroyed the circle himself, he decided to start from scratch. The next moment he felt tired again and almost collapsed to the ground. Noticing that Simon had not given up and was trying to keep fighting, Hector used the curse on him again. But it didn't end once like last time. This time he continued to use the curse on the protagonist over and over again. The rest of the students looked at this scene with confusion. Stopping at 5 iteration, Hector said that should be enough. Barely able to stay on his feet, Simon could hear the chatter of a student who wondered with disdain if he was really number 1 once unable to start a single spell. Turning to Simon, who was breathing heavily, Hector told him to give up, adding that he was pathetic to look at. Not seeing that the guy was going to give up, Hector asked irritably if he wanted to see how it ended. He used another curse that was noticeably stronger than the previous ones, causing Simon to groan in pain and clench his teeth. As Professor Bahil watched the contest from the sidelines, he pondered the potential of the contestants. Concluding that Hector was a gem that did not lie in the road, besides his talent, he also possessed the mindset of a Kizen student. He would most likely become an outstanding student who could survive to the 3rd grade. On the other hand, a special admission number 1 who had no prior training or basic knowledge of dark magic, let alone any real experience. Professor Bahil couldn't help but wonder why Nephthys had chosen this particular boy. Numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, who are officially invited into Kizen without passing preliminary exams, are supposed to be talents that are born once every few centuries. Especially number 1, who was always chosen by Nephthys herself and was bound to achieve outstanding results in his field. However, in the guy he was looking at now, he did not at all see the potential that was supposed to be in a person called the most talented. Looking at Simon, who despite his opponent's numerous attacks continued to stand on his feet, Bahil speculated that perhaps his specialty was stamina. Since normal students of his age kneel down after the 4th graduation, but he continued to stay on his feet even after the 9th graduation. Furthermore, he continued to maintain the magic circle while it was incredibly difficult for him to just stay awake, which was a testament to the fact that his spirit was also incredibly strong. But unfortunately that wasn't what was needed to pass the test, as magic combat professors valued physical and mental strength, so his specialty had nothing to do with it. But to his surprise, Simon, despite all the weakening curses placed on him, not only managed to stay on his feet, but also managed to complete the magic circle. After which, he shouted the exhaust spell. He released a weakening curse directly at Hector, who did not expect such a repulse from an opponent who could hardly stand on his feet. Bahil's teacher froze in place with admiration on his face, unable to believe what he had just seen. Simon was also glowing with happiness, even though he was only able to land a single blow. Holding his hand to the floor, Hector couldn't believe what had just happened. Nor could he believe that such an exhaust power could even exist. Not even during the prep session had this happened. Unwilling to accept that he could be attacked at all, he promised himself that he would never miss another spell again, and that he would end this annoying fight right now. Creating a new spell, he furiously shouted an exhaust spell and used it on Simon, who groaned painfully. The next moment, the adjustment device fell to the floor, followed by the defeated Simon, who had no strength to stand. The match was over, and Professor Bahil congratulated Hector on his victory with a smile on his face, but Hector didn't look happy about the victory, even though the whole class was cheering and shouting his name. Then turning to Simon, who was still on his knees, and having removed the effects of the weakening, the teacher also praised him, saying that he had done a great job and was able to show a great match. He then clapped his hands and announced the end of today's class. At the end of the class, one of the students approached Bahil and said that she had some questions about today's lecture. To which he replied that she should come to his office after today's class and he would answer all her questions. Hearing this, the girl glowed with joy and thanked the professor. Bahil, however, told himself that he couldn't lose such a precious moment for the sake of some frivolous girl. Simon Valencia, said Bahil alone standing in the middle of the empty classroom. That last release he was able to make at the end, it was far more valuable than the 9 exhausts Hector performed. That was the best strike, muttered Bahil with a delighted smile. Walking down the corridor, Simon felt very tired, as did the plant, which turned out to be more resilient than expected. Simon sank down in his chair and sighed heavily, then rested his forehead against the desk. He wondered why all the classes at the academy were so difficult. The blonde guy who sat down at his table said that it was because he was the first special admissions. Simon asked in confusion what that had to do with his classes being so hard. The guy explained that at Kizen there was tough competition not only among students, but also among professors. Incompetent professors could be fired even in the middle of a semester, and there were cases when the monthly salary suddenly changed. But those who show great results have great influence in the academy. Simon asked what he was getting at. The guy continued, saying that it was because of the competition that all the professors were trying to recruit good students, and now they just had to turn on their brains and think about what would happen if there was a student who was rated as the most talented. It finally dawned on the boy that the professor had called him in front of the class to test his skills. Confirming Simon's speculation, the blonde-haired guy also mentioned about the girl who was called his colleague. Even though it was hard for Simon to think in his condition, he could still remember that her name was Malin Willen. The boy said that Simon was right, adding that she was the best in the whole course, so it was easy to see how good he was compared to her. But that didn't cheer Simon up one bit, since he'd never been able to beat her, and even Hector could barely cast a single spell. The light-haired boy replied that that was why all the professors were confused, because they expected him to be a genius, but in fact he turned out to be a novice. After understanding the explanation, Simon turned to the guy and thanked him, and then with a nonchalant face asked for his name. This question made the blonde-haired boy resentful, as he couldn't understand how Simon couldn't remember his name, which he had told him during Professor Bahil's class. Then he added loudly that his name was Dick Hayward, and that he was in the same class as Simon. Standing up from the table, Dick asked Simon about the talk that was going on about him. Realizing what he was talking about, the protagonist replied that they were probably talking about the fact that he was probably not so special anymore. Dick laughed and replied that he shouldn't take it to heart, because it was normal to be himself, and he also didn't understand what all the fuss was about on the first day. Then he noted that even though it was only noon, Simon looked exhausted. He grinned and replied that it was because he had used up all his stamina in Professor Bahil's class. Remembering that his new friend had gotten 10 curses at a time, Dick agreed that it was probably normal to be exhausted after that. It was fun, though. This phrase shocked the blonde-haired boy, who stared at Simon in surprise. The same one glowing with joy said that although it was a bit difficult, the class itself was fun. Leaning over to Simon, who was looking at him in bewilderment, Dick wagged his finger at him, saying that he was strange because it couldn't be fun, then added that that wasn't their main problem right now. Then whispered that Hector had already started forming his clique. Not understanding anything, Simon asked what he was talking about. Dick pointed to Hector, who was being introduced by a boy, and explained that he had impressed a lot of the guys in Professor Bahil's class, so it wasn't surprising that there was a lot of excitement about him. He was also the eldest son of an influential family, which made him popular among the noble children. But all this information did not interest Simon, who indifferently replied that he was not interested. But Dick was not going to be so easy to ask, and approaching Simon he said emotionally that politics was also important. Then he asked Simon if he knew what would happen if the whole class fell under Hector's influence. Those who would lose their favor with him would be outcasts, as well as unable to find team members for the group. Realizing that Dick was well versed in politics, Simon asked him why he had come to him and not to Hector. He scratched the back of his head and replied that he was a commoner from a merchant family. Simon was surprised, for he had heard that everyone was treated equally at Kizen. Dick grinned and replied that it was true. But unfortunately there were still some children from noble families who wanted to show their superiority. Hearing this, Simon replied that at least he was not, which pleased Dick, who was about to offer him something. "Join my group, Simon," said Dick enthusiastically, pointing a finger at himself. Then he assured Simon that whether you lacked skills or were told you had them, he was special admission number 1. In addition, kids who took the prep courses might seem better in class now, but with time, if you worked hard, things would even out. And there was no way Nephthys would pick him for nothing. Then, pointing his finger at Simon, Dick said excitedly that, to put it another way, he was hiding talents that even he didn't know he had. There was an awkward pause. After which Simon replied with a laugh. That he couldn't say anything about joining his band yet. But smiling and holding out his hand to Dick, Simon suggested that they start with friendship. The offer seemed to surprise the boy. He waved his hands and said that in Kizen it was a very awkward word that was rarely heard, adding that it sounded cringeworthy. But seeing that Simon was serious and not even joking, he scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Then, holding out his hand in return, Dick replied that it would be nice to have a friend, and Simon agreed. Dick said that they would soon be leaving again for the next C class. Simon agreed and asked what the next class would be. Dick looked at the schedule and said that it was summonology. This news made Simon very happy, which made him glow with happiness. For now he could summon creatures on his own, just as his father had done. Hopefully, he and Dick headed to the next class. As Simon climbed the stairs in search of empty seats, he heard conversations that mocked him, calling him the biggest failure in Kizen's history. Hector's jackal sitting next to him mockingly mentioned that he was also said to be better than Cerna, Châtel, and Lorraine, mockingly adding that it was bullshit. Hector just stared at Simon in silence, not saying a word. Dick sat down next to Simon and told him not to pay attention to them, because they just wanted to assert themselves at the expense of others. But the protagonist did not care. His only desire and the object of all his attention was the draft class, and all he did was to stare at one point with the look of a fool in love, waiting for the class to begin. Watching this, Dick could not help noting that his new friend was rather strange. Suddenly footsteps were heard in the corridor. At the same time Simon could not understand why his friend called him strange, for no one had ever said such things to him before, to which he replied that from now on he would hear part of it. At the same time a man came into the hall yawning. His appearance did not match the professor's, and the students began to whisper, wondering who it could be. The man walked to the table and put his hands on it. Then raised his head and introduced himself as Arandia, their recruitment teacher for this semester. Then without changing his tone he began his lecture, beginning by saying that summonology was the root of all necromancers, as well as their history. Starting to write something in chalk on the blackboard, he continued, telling the bewildered students that even though the scholars did not recognize it, that necromancers were descended from thieves of Thrun, gravediggers, and other similar occupations. Pointing behind him to the blackboard where the single word summonology was written in chalk, he continued, saying that if the students had ears, they had probably heard many stories about summonology. Lagging behind the times, badly treated, hard to learn, lots of flaws and nuances, he said. Exactly the kind of prejudices you might have heard towards necromancers, said Professor Aaron. However, most of them are true, he added, contrary to all the expectations of the students who were shocked by his words, to the last hoping that he would say that they were all just rumors. However, the reality turned out to be cruel. A murmur went through the class, as the students did not understand how the professor of the draft could say such things. However, the professor, who looked more like a common warrior than a teacher, went on to say that they must have enjoyed all the previous classes, as the professors had only told them the delights of their specialty. However, he said he didn't support that attitude, adding that he thought everyone should know both the pros and cons of a specialization in order to make the right decision. Therefore, he started with the disadvantages, which surprised the students who had encountered it for the first time. The first disadvantage was that it was expensive, and no matter how much you calculate it, it still comes out to be several times more costly. The materials fee for conscription can be several times more than for all other specialties combined. This price for materials is due to the fact that suitable materials were not very common, but that was no reason to kill people or animals to get materials. Therefore, in modern times, summoners use skeleton kits or specially processed corpses for summoning. He went on to explain that most often summoners spent more money on materials than they received in reward for the mission, so he advised students who were going to study summonology not to expect to earn money. And the second drawback was that the summoner depended heavily on summoned creatures, because if you think about it, summonology is all about battles with summoned creatures. But when the summoner's creatures are destroyed, the summoner's power is drastically reduced by more than 80%. Part of the problem was the first drawback, but these days summoners are more likely to use a semi-permanent remade undead rather than a disposable one. If they lose these semi-permanent undead, they suffer both strategic and financial damage. Until they rebuild their summoned creature or replace it with a new one, they can only watch from the sidelines as their counterparts fight. The third and most important disadvantage was that the summoners were weak against the priests, to be precise. Summonology was no match for modern howling, and that was no joke. The time when summonology could fully realize its potential was total war, as during battles summoners get an unlimited supply of materials for summoning undead, because dead bodies could be found literally everywhere. But even after the truce, modern warfare continues in the form of small localized battles. And for such quick and traceless battles best suited mages who specialized in curses, as well as spirit controllers. While necromancy was very weak against priests, who could destroy the entire army with a single holy spell, which was very inefficient, as the cost of recovery would be enormous. After telling the disadvantages, the professor added that there were a few more, but in any case the choice was left to the students. As soon as he finished, Jamie immediately raised her hand, calling out to the professor. Having introduced herself, she asked with interest, "So what were the advantages of summonology?" The professor looked at the girl with a frown. He replied that he didn't remember allowing her to ask questions, which took the girl by surprise, and she confusedly sat down and apologized. Advantages. The number as well as the possibility of applying different tactics in battle using summoned creatures. Without enthusiasm in his voice replied the professor, which sounded like he was omitting too many advantages, and in general was not interested to interest the students. Without naming more advantages, he turned to the students and said that only they should decide whether to take summonology in the second semester or not, but added that they should not forget one thing. Don't even dream of setting foot in this field if you don't have the guts for it. After this motivational speech, the professor added that if anyone is going to cry, whine, turn away or consult him about changing their major after the second year for financial reasons or whatever, they shouldn't even consider majoring in that field with such a characterless mindset. As the students listened to his words, they looked at him in confusion. The assistants, who had already listened to these words apparently not for the first time, sighed tiredly. The professor did not stop, saying that if someone hopes to specialize in summonology only because there is less competition for survival, I will personally expel you. Okay, that's it, let's get to class. To which the class tentatively agreed. Simon picked up a box with unknown contents, which was provided by his assistants, and listened to the professor's instructions, who explained that these boxes contained the bones of sharp-blooded rat catchers. Opening the lid, the guy saw a lot of different bones that were signed and sorted into compartments. The choice towards rat bones was justified by the similarity to human body structure, making it cheaper and easier than normal human skeletons. Tossing one of the skulls into the air with his hand, the instructor explained that most beginning summoners start with island rat bones. Pointing to a poster that the assistant was trying to hang on the wall at the time, he explained that it was the Pied Piper's bone structure. Then deciding to start practicing, he ordered everyone to pull out skull number 1. Adding for them the skull was already assembled by default. One of the girls took the skull in her hands and remarked that it was quite creepy, to which the other girl replied that despite that it was very clean. Seeing that most of the students had already examined the skulls, the professor told the students to put their hand through the hole that was located right under the skull. There should be a magical corrective circle inside. He added that it was exactly where they should put their hand and activate the magic circle. Simon held the skull in his hands and followed the professor's commands. Soon the boy managed to find the hole where the magic circle was located, which was supposed to work as a corrector, and then he stretched out his hand, deciding to try. Once the magic circle is complete. But he didn't have time to finish, as the next moment there were squeals and frightened screams from the students around the classroom, who, without listening to the end, activated the circles, causing the heads of the island rat catchers to come to life and start wreaking havoc around the classroom. While the students, obviously unprepared for such a turn, were frightened, not realizing what was going on. The professor smirked as if he hadn't seen this coming and said that he was going to tell them not to be frightened by the fact that the undead would come back to life after the activation. But unfortunately he was too late, to which there were angry voices from the class saying that it was rather cruel and low. Simon, who had also activated the skull, ordered him not to move, which he immediately did. Seeing that Simon had been able to calm the skull so quickly, and that he was treating it as something ordinary, Dick asked if he had ever experienced such things before. To which Simon replied that he'd just seen them a lot before. With a loud clap on the table to attract attention, the professor told the students to get used to it, as they were necromancers, and then added that once the magic circle was activated, the process of creating undead could be considered complete. Since the head couldn't move on its own, it needed to create a body, and for that, necromancers needed to be familiar with the bone structure of the summoned creature. Unlike the human body which had 206 bones, the body of the island ratcatcher only had 53 bones, which was much simpler. Following the instructions of the professor, who said to take the number 2 neck bone and connect it to the skull, Simon found the right bone and began to carefully bring it to the skull. Suddenly the bone, like a magnet, jumped out of the guy's hand and stuck to the skull. The professor explained that skeletons have a tendency to return to their original form, and therefore, if you follow certain rules, the assembly should not be difficult, to which Simon replied in surprise that it was, while the skull of Dick, who decided that the head of his summoner was not necessary, tried to correct this misunderstanding. The professor continued to explain what to do, saying that now they should move on to bones number 3, 4, and so on up to 11. The students, despite the fact that it was not the easiest thing to do, followed his instructions with interest, and also consulted with each other. But not everyone had a good time, because some of them, before hearing the professor's warning to be careful not to mix up the bones of the upper back with the lower bones, which was very important, had already made this mistake, which again led to incidents with rodents, which, out of control, began to attack the innocent neighbors of those who had managed to mix up the bones. The professor said that if the creature is assembled incorrectly, it will not move smoothly. And in some cases it could break in the most important places at the most crucial moment. Hector folded his arms on his chest without showing any emotion, sitting in front of his perfectly assembled undead, while his minions sucked up to him praising him and telling him that he was the best. While the rest of the students following the professor's instructions were at 16 dice, Malin finished assembling her undead and sat with a bored look. Soon most of the students were able to get to bone 53, which was almost the end. The professor told the students not to be silent and to raise their hand if they were stuck somewhere and didn't know what to do. Immediately after his words, several students raised their hands to say that they were not doing well. At the same time he finished his first skeleton, which he had created with the help of his darkness. Simon smiled contentedly at his creation as he heard the voice of his new friend calling helplessly for him. Pointing to his undead, which was sitting on the table in a strange pose, Dick tearfully asked Simon why his skeleton was always trying to put a leg bone in his hand. After a glimpse of the undead, Simon pointed to the shoulder joint, adding that he had probably placed the leg bone where the arm bone should have been, which made the summoned creature move so strangely. Dick looked at his undead more closely and was surprised to see that Simon was right, then grumbled about why the bones were so similar. After a while, Professor Aaron announced that the time for collecting skeletons had been exhausted, adding that there would now be a demonstration of what they had gone through in class. As expected, he called Simon first, who had already accepted his fate and nodded obediently. Dick patted him on the back and wished him luck. The next student to be called by the teacher was Hector Moore. Hector Moore, whom he also summoned to come to the front of the class. Once again standing opposite each other and keeping their eyes on each other, they listened attentively to the teacher, who informed them that they had 10 minutes until the end of the class. Then he began to explain the essence of the competition, which was to collect the skeleton of his undead and using it to get a necklace. The winner will be the one who at the end of the class and will have a necklace. He also said that they could not take it with their hands and use dark magic, except for these 2 rules everything else was allowed. After the professor finished explaining the rules he told the guys to get ready and start as soon as he gave the command, after which they immediately knelt down and opened the box of bones. As soon as Professor Aaron gave the sign, the boys immediately grabbed a skull each of their future summoned creatures. Holding the skull in his hands, Simon told himself with a smile on his face that he could definitely win. After activating the magic seal, he decided to start with the spine and then move on to the other parts. Holding the skull in his hand, Simon looked at the board where the mouse skeleton structure was supposed to hang. However, to his surprise he found that one of the assistants had already started to remove it from the board. Noticing the boys' puzzled look, Professor Aaron explained that in this match was not allowed to cheat, and peeking at the skeletal structure was just that. The boys were quite shocked by this news. Despite the fact that the scheme was unavailable, Simon still had hope for the numbers that were labeled all the bones, which greatly simplified the task. So he immediately decided to collect everything in order, starting with number 1. But the next moment, to his confusion, he discovered that the bones had no numbers on them, contrary to his expectations. Seeing Simon's confusion, the teacher Aaron explained that of course there were no numbers on the real bones, and the ones they used for training were training bones, adding that it was only through the teacher's hard work that they could use the bones with numbers for training. Then he asked Simon in a cold voice, "Didn't I already tell you that? A necromancer should be familiar with all of this." Hector was the first to start assembling his skeleton. He was concentrating on putting the bones together according to the way he had memorized them, and he was doing quite well. Meanwhile, Simon could not quickly recover from the lack of clues he had received earlier, but he was not going to give up and was serious. He convinced himself that since he was able to put it together last time, he should be able to do it this time. He just needed to recall the sequence of the main bones. Simon started with bone number 2, which was supposed to be attached to the skull. Professor Aaron silently watched the students' attempts without expressing any emotion. It seemed that he was interested in very few things in life, and teaching students was definitely not on that list. But he still watched the students, and it seemed that special admission number 1 had never assembled a skeleton in his life and now he would not succeed. While the other student, a big boy, had memorized the order and structure of the skeleton and had already completed it. The professor noticed that he relied on his knowledge and memory, and the preparatory courses he took before the class helped him with this, but he also avoided critical mistakes thanks to his intuition. He definitely had a bit of talent, but as far as special admission number 1 goes, he almost broke down. It was obvious that he hadn't taken the preparatory courses and the professor didn't understand why. Simon, meanwhile, was hesitating whether he was picking up the bones in the right order or not. Professor Aaron looked at the students watching the competition and thought that only Hector seemed to have a bit of talent in this class. Hector was the first to get his island mouse skeleton to stand on its own 2 feet. As the students cheered, he thought he was going to win. He had almost completely assembled the skeleton, only the arms were left. Hector thought that since he was the first to assemble the skeleton, the victory was in his hands, and after that Simon would never have a chance against him again. His rodent skeleton was already completely ready. He looked at Simon with a strong desire to make him a laughingstock in front of the whole class, destroying his credibility and his reputation as the number 1 special admission. And with an angry gnashing of his teeth, he added quietly to himself that he wanted to watch Simon fall to the floor. Hector didn't waste a minute and set his skeleton on the target. And step by step, he approached the table with the decoration. To the delighted shouts of the students, Hector's mouse jumped onto the professor's desk. The mouse immediately ran to the necklace. Then it immediately ran with the jewelry in its paws to its owner. Simon saw all this and realized that he had 5 minutes left before the bell rang, and if Hector still had the necklace, he would win. Simon could not let that happen. He continued to assemble his skeleton with trembling hands. Simon thought he couldn't jump in over his head, since Hector was more prepared and he had only assembled the skeleton once before. The chances of winning it were slim. His only way to win was to give up trying in vain to do what he was taught in class. He wouldn't succeed anyway. He just had to trust his own gut feeling, and he smashed what he had tried to put together before without success. Simon was just going to put the bones back together the way he imagined and felt. The students started whispering in surprise and seemed to be asking, "What is this? What is he doing? Did he start all over again wrong? Maybe he's giving up." Gradually, their whispers turned into mockery. They said that he had no talent or inner sense. Simon did not pay attention to them. His new friend Dick was very worried about him, while the other students did not understand why he was number one. Simon reflected that when the professor announced the rules, he said to get the necklace using the skeleton, not to make the skeleton perfect, so all was not lost for him. He had no time. He had to forget about complex structures and make his skeleton as simple as possible. He began to assemble the new skeleton and started by adding the front legs, which he remembered were number 20. Then he added part number 27, because it was the main part, and it went very quickly. He skipped some parts, put others in the wrong places. The professor noticed his attempts and wondered what he was doing. Then he looked closely and was very surprised. How could this be? It was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. The professor could not believe that Simon had done it and how he had managed to do it at all. It was the bone structure of a gray rat. And its eyes were burning with Simon's midnight darkness. The gray rats were the ancestors of the rat men who now lived on the island. And he was able to do this because they had similar bone structures, but the gray rats were much simpler in structure. Professor Aaron could not believe that he was able to recreate another creature simply by rearranging the bones. Of course, the skeleton was not exactly the same, but it was definitely an undead thing that could move. The professor was beginning to realize what Simon had done and was very impressed that a student with no training could do it. How could he come to this conclusion based on his gut instinct instead of knowledge? The professor was beginning to understand why he was the number one choice of Nephthys. Meanwhile, Simon's friends were supporting him fiercely, telling him not to stop and to keep going. The mood of the students in the classroom also began to change. They no longer considered him a complete loser, although they did not quite understand what was happening. Only the upstart Jamie Victoria kept saying that she had made the perfect skeleton, and he was not acting according to the rules. But the smarter students realized that the shape didn't matter. Even those who were the first to assemble their training skeletons without looking at the diagram realized that they could not have done it that way. And all the students were on Simon's side and supporting him, which was very annoying for Hector, who believed that he should be the center of attention. He was furious and did not understand why everyone was supporting his rival. With all his anger, he directed his skeleton at the mutant that Simon had made. His skeleton remained intact due to its greater mass and more complete structure, while the other one was shattered. Hector looked at Simon's confused face and mentally proclaimed himself the winner. He was sure he had won and smiled smugly. But something was very wrong. Simon was smiling instead of being sad. He made a quick movement with his hand. And parts of his skeleton flew into the air, taking the necklace with them. The paw of his skeleton pulled the necklace off his opponent with a loud thud. The confused Hector did not have time to react and his unwilling servant stood there frozen. A paw of bones clutching the necklace flew toward Simon. And then the bell suddenly rang, first once. Then again. Hector didn't understand what had happened. The victory was in his hands. How could he lose? He said it was not fair and demanded that the professor stop this nonsense. After all, he had said at the beginning of the competition that you had to get the necklace using a skeleton, and it was just a piece of bone. Hector was shocked and furious. But Simon interrupted his whining with a surprised question, "Just a bone?" Hector flinched. Simon said he didn't think so and made a confident movement with his hand. Suddenly, with a crash, the parts of his skeleton began to come together. Hector watched in horror as part by part, bone by bone, Simon's undead body came together on its own. It was the first time he had seen this. A moment later, the whole skeleton stood in front of him again. Simon asked him, "So what now? Is it really just a bone?" The necklace remained in the skeleton's mouth. On the orders of its master, the skeleton spat the necklace right into his hands. And he raised the necklace right in front of Hector's face, laughing in his face. Furious, Hector could barely contain himself and gritted his teeth to keep from lashing out at Simon. But they were stopped by the professor, who said enough is enough. As usual, he tiredly began to announce the winner, and it was Simon Valencia. At first Simon hesitated for a second, but then he quickly grabbed his skeleton and picked it up. And he raised it above his head in front of the whole class. He was very happy. Simon was sincerely happy to win with his skeleton. He finally won, and not to be disgraced as he usually was before. After the first day of school was over, the professors met to discuss the students' results, and they started by saying that everyone agreed that there were many capable students enrolled this year. The special recruitment students and those who got the highest marks in the entrance exams were the best, especially Malin Villeneuve, who was even better than expected. She was able to do Shanif poison on the first try. It was impressive. The other teachers completely agreed with this opinion, and one of them added that the blood of the Villian family is thicker than water. All 7 children from this family have incredible abilities. Then they mentioned the heiress of the Ivory Tower, Saren, who also showed excellent results, and it was clear why her parents were so proud of her. Chatel Mayer was not forgotten either, as he completely broke the stereotypical notions of half-giants, as there was a prejudice that they had no magical skills at all, but this was not true at all, and Chatel was very capable in the field of specialization of magic. Professor Bahil mockingly asked them if they had already chosen their favorites and reminded them that it was forbidden to force students to specialize during the protected period for newcomers. But they did not respond to his words, instead asking how his class went today. Bahil asked with an innocent smile what they meant. But they told him not to pretend, and that he knew they wanted to hear about special admission number 1, whom Naftis had personally selected. He shrugged and calmly replied that the student had lost 10-1 to another student in the class, and he was not at all convinced that he had much talent. The other professors reacted with some restraint, saying that this was not expected, but he was still special admission number 1, so was he sure that there was nothing special about him? Professor Bahil pretended to think about it and then added that he had good stamina, having endured 9 curses of exhaustion before he collapsed in his first class. The other professors were not at all pleased. 9 times is certainly a lot and stamina is good, but not at all impressive for special admission number 1. While everyone was discussing the students, Professor Aaron, as usual, was bored on the sidelines. Unfortunately for him, Bahil noticed him and told him that he was also teaching a class today, wasn't he? Aaron was in no hurry to answer and calmly poured himself some tea. Then he turned to them and said that yes, he was teaching the class. But this answer did not satisfy Bahil at all, and he asked him directly what he thought about special admission number 1. Aaron realized that he couldn't avoid answering, so he said that in his opinion special admission number 1 is a slow mediocre guy, but he has a little originality to make some creative though defective designs. Bahil's hand with the cup trembled from this answer, although no one noticed. Everyone started whispering and discussing that the number 1 special admission was not so special this year and wondered how that could be, since it was chosen by Neftis herself. Bahil couldn't believe what had just happened. It seemed that only he had noticed it, so Aaron had put up a smokescreen in front of everyone and not said everything, which could only mean one thing. Aaron was known to be a complicated person, and such a statement from him meant only one thing: he liked special admission number 1 very much. Bahil knew it for sure. After all, a slow and mediocre guy with originality in making creative defective designs. It was the best compliment Aaron could give. Bahil continued to think, the guy chosen by Neftis and set on by the fastidious Aaron was becoming more and more interesting to Bahil, and he had a desire to play with Aaron for a while. He approached him and the latter turned to him with a questioning look. Bahil asked about the statement he had made last year. Did he still stand by it? Aaron did not understand what he was talking about and asked again, last year? Yes, that statement that Aaron was no longer going to directly mentor students. Bahil said it with a seemingly friendly and innocent smile, but Aaron understood what was behind the question and lost all his confidence. He started to stammer out an excuse that he didn't mean it, when suddenly, bam! Neftis herself joyfully burst into the room, greeting everyone there. Immediately, all conversation stopped and everyone bowed their heads in respect to her, and she continued to greet them carefree as if they were not her subordinates, just friends. Bahil took out an ice cream from his magic pocket and was about to give it to Neftis with a smile. She kind of exclaimed in surprise that she was surprised and had already told him to stop spoiling her like a child, but nevertheless reached out for the ice cream. Bahil told her that the virtue of being a gentleman included preparing snacks for a lady. Neftis was pleased, waiting for the opportunity to taste her gift, and said what a smooth talker he was, and she just had to take this ice cream since she was given it. The other professors were shocked that he was carrying around a subspace freezer. Another professor pulled out a chair for her and invited her to sit down. She gladly sat down and asked how the students had performed on the first day. And the professors began to praise the different students they had talked about before, and Nephthys began to eat her ice cream with pleasure and agreed with everything. She was very pleased with so many talented students in this year's first year and hoped that the protection period for new students would soon be over. Aaron looked at Nephthys and hesitated. Nephthys smugly said that it was all great and they could report any problems to her, and if there were none, then because it was the first day of school, they could go home early and rest. Everyone was all for it. But Aaron was not going to leave and asked Nephthys if they could discuss something in private. All the professors were very surprised and looked at him questioningly, but Nephthys was not at all confused by this question and she gladly agreed. Bahil watched them leave the room. As they left, Nephthys asked what Aaron wanted to discuss, but he said he would tell her only when they were alone. Bahil noted to himself that Aaron was as straightforward as ever. But he didn't worry about it, because Nephthys would never just say what they wanted to know. Let's get back to our students. Simon and Dick were looking for a place in the dormitory, and in all the rooms they had visited there was only one free place left, and they wanted to share a room. Simon knew what the reason was. They had come to the dorm too late. All the students who were looking for a room were from their group, because summonology lasted 3 hours, so students from other groups had already taken almost all the rooms. They approached the girl in charge of student accommodation and asked if there were any rooms with 2 more free places. But she told them that unfortunately there were no such rooms on the first and second floors. Also, after looking at the scheme, they found out together that even on the third and fourth floors there were no 2 free places, as well as on all other floors. They asked if they could go to the rooms and try to negotiate with the students to change places. And when they were told yes, Simon told Dick that he wanted to go look around the floors and try to find something, in case something worked out. The girl said she would go with them and help them, and she didn't notice that a group of students was approaching them from the side. Suddenly, they told the girl to move away and then immediately hit her with a tray with their suitcases. The girl fell down and the suitcases fell apart. One of those students claimed that it was all her fault, he had told her to move. The poor girl started apologizing. They told her that a caretaker like her only gets in the way, and all this happened because of her. How would she compensate them for the damage? The girl only managed to apologize under a stream of accusations and insults. When she apologized, they told her to excuse her ass for standing there, to quickly pack up her things and get out of their way. The poor girl agreed and said she would do it. But they were interrupted by Simon, who told them he was sorry, but can't they see he was talking to her? And he stood between the girl and these hooligans. Dick backed him up, saying that they were here first, so they shouldn't cut in line, and that they saw them deliberately hit the girl. It seems that these guys were nobles, so they asked them arrogantly if they were out of their minds. They were commoners, what do they think they are? However, one of them noticed something and started to push his friends. He pointed at Simon and said that he had seen him before and that he was special admission number 1 and that he had taken the oath in front of all the students. Simon's appearance scared them. They quickly and nervously packed their bags and quickly got away, threatening the girl to be careful next time. Dick laughed at those losers, and the girl thanked Simon for his help and he assured her that she didn't need to thank him, he just did what he had to do. The girl was very grateful to them and invited them to follow her. She checked her notes again more carefully and happily reported that there was actually 1 room left with 2 free beds. It was on the 4th floor, room 409, it had a great view and was close to the main staircase. She started checking which students had already moved in while our friends waited behind her. But something was wrong. The girl turned to them and uncertainly said that rooms 412 and 413 also had vacancies and were located next to each other and invited them to look at them. The friends did not understand what was wrong with room 409 and asked her. The girl began to clumsily excuse herself by saying that students were already living there. And one of them. But Simon didn't seem to care and just wanted to join those who were already living there. Then she told him a story about a student who lived there. His name was Kizen Edvald, and he had already studied here last year. Simon then had a logical question about what he was doing in the freshman dormitory. The girl explained that he was unable to transfer to the second year. She had heard that he had some problems and had to start over. She whispered to them that she was just a dormitory supervisor and didn't know all the details, but she had heard that many of those who shared a room with him had asked for permission to change rooms. Those students had bruises on their faces and he got into trouble because of it. Usually Kizen quickly expels problem students, so it was strange that they made an exception for Kajin Edvald. Dick started to ask Simon to choose another room. But he wanted to at least say hello to the residents of room 409, and Dick was shocked by this idea. He asked if he was really going to go in there. Simon took hold of the doorknob and creaked the door open. They walked into a room that was in semi-darkness. Simon said hello and apologized for the intrusion and for waking the residents. The silhouette lying on the bed stirred. A bandaged hand gripped the edge of the bed as Simon asked if they could move into the room. Dick was terrified at the prospect of living with such a neighbor, but Simon although the man's look and appearance was quite scary. But the look of his red eye with a scar made goosebumps run through his body. It turned out that he was not as angry as he seemed at first glance. He sat up on the bed holding his head and remarked that time was flying fast since today was the initiation ceremony for the newcomers. He added that they didn't have to be so nice to him, he wasn't a professor, and after all, he was a freshman like them. Dick was still scared and hid behind Simon, who came closer to the bed and agreed, but made another mistake and called his new roommate Mr. Kajin. He told him to drop it and just call him Kajin. He turned to them and told them that he didn't know how long they would be staying at this school, but they should remember two things. The first thing was to keep their noses out of his business. The second thing was not to make any noise or fuss until he went to bed, and once he was asleep, they could dance, sing, or do whatever they wanted. But Kajin still hadn't answered whether he allowed them to stay here, so Simon asked if they could stay. Kajin replied that it didn't matter, did it? Someone would come here anyway when there were no more rooms, so they should stay. And he immediately dozed off under their astonished gazes. Simon confidently told the dormitory manager that they were taking the room. She couldn't quite believe it, so she asked if they were sure they would be okay. Simon was sure that they would be fine, because it seemed that their neighbor was not as bad as they had heard about him, although he looked a bit rough. The dormitory manager agreed and just warned them that if they had any problems later, they shouldn't hesitate to let her know. She would then immediately notify the head manager of the dormitories to take care of it. Simon was very grateful to this girl for her concern. They said goodnight and closed the door behind them in their new room 409 with a creak. Dick asked if he really thought their neighbor would not wake up. Simon wasn't sure, but he had just told them to do whatever they wanted as long as he was asleep. So Dick decided to check it out. He threw the stack of books he was holding and they hit the floor very loudly, scaring Simon. And it turned out that Kajin was indeed still sleeping despite the noise. Dick was beginning to like him, and he said that in the end he didn't think Kajin was a bad person, as long as they followed his rules they had nothing to worry about. And since they had found their room and moved their stuff, it was time to take a shower. He had seen the bathhouse on the second floor on their way up and he was going to check it out. Simon asked quite cautiously, "A bath?" A minute later he was already shouting in excitement how much he loved her, and it was obvious because he was beaming with happiness. He had never felt so warm and soft. As they walked back together from the bath, Dick was surprised that he had never seen anyone so enthusiastic about an ordinary shower stall. He asked Simon with a smile if he had ever lived far away in the mountains or something similar. Simon replied that yes, something like that. Dick continued to talk and asked him to at least stop saying, "Wow," every time he pressed the buttons in the shower. Other students would not understand this behavior. Simon asked if he really did that. Dick assured him that he was, and now the whole school would not only be talking about him as special submission number 1, but now he would be called a bumpkin on top of being called a fake. Simon was ashamed of this prospect. They went into their room talking about how good it was to be in Kizen and how lucky they were to be here. They probably all wanted to be here. But whether or not they could stay here depended on their grades. Simon had heard that only 300 or so students in their second year were supposed to stay. Dick said that this was true. There are so many cohorts of students now only because there is still a period of student protection and they just have to wait a little bit and they will see at least half of the students drop out right away. But Simon didn't know what the protection period meant, so he asked what it was. Dick explained to him that it is a period when professors cannot officially evaluate students and give them grades. During this period professors cannot personally communicate with students and they cannot expel students at their discretion. They also can't harm students, and there are so many other things that are forbidden, he can't remember them all. Simon was shocked by this information, so he was still being lenient in everything that happened today. What would happen next? Dick continued that after this period, expulsions would be a constant occurrence due to lack of academic performance, lack of visibility of future success, rule violations, unsatisfactory homework, and other lesser reasons. But, if he can hang in there at least until the end of his first year, he can expect to find a job almost anywhere in the future. And if he can survive the intense competition and officially graduate, then he will be a leader in an era that will move entire continents. And Dick pointed his finger directly at the surprised Simon. Then he added that he would be able to become absolutely anything, except a member of the royal family. Although in fact, some small kingdom might offer him a princess to marry if he could graduate from Kizen. Simon heard this and asked if he wanted to become a nobleman. Dick replied that no, although there would be many advantages if he were one, it was not his goal. Simon then clarified his question, what then is his goal? Dick held up his hand and showed him how he rubbed his fingers in a well-known gesture. Money, that was his main and probably only goal. Simon now had an idea of what lay ahead and was serious about working hard to stay in Kizen as long as possible. He started rubbing his ring that Lorraine had bought him. Dick had already started to say that if he ever needed money, he would. When suddenly Simon opened his subspace and a box with a set of dice flew out, surprising and maybe even scaring his friend a little. The latter was amazed and did not hesitate to show it. He just bombarded Simon with questions. What is this? And how did he just do that? Simon explained that it was subspace. And in his hands he was holding a skeleton kit for an island ratman. He had bought it when he was shopping with Lorraine. Now he was going to practice to catch up with the other students who were taking the preparatory courses. Dick couldn't believe that he was going to practice after they had just come from class, and Simon replied that he just didn't want to forget everything he had learned and experienced today in summonology class. Then he asked that this time he was going to put it together in the right order this time, right? But Simon replied that he wanted to try again to trust his gut feeling this time. He began to assemble the bone by bone, following his gut instinct. Dick watched him fascinated. A few minutes later, another unusual skeleton Simon had assembled was walking across the floor. Dick looked at it and noted that it was the same as the one he had collected in the classroom. Simon replied that yes, in general it was the same, but it should have been better, because he spent more time on it, but one of its legs was wobbly for some reason. Despite the fact that it was a skeleton, it was even somewhat cute. Dick said that despite his shortcomings, Simon had made a skeleton that he probably would never be able to. Simon apologized to his incomprehensible creature, who was looking at him questioningly. And the next moment he broke it into its component parts with a crunch. His friend was very surprised by this behavior. He asked what was wrong. It was such a beautiful skeleton, why did he destroy it? Simon did not answer, absorbed in his thoughts, and this made Dick worry about him. He was absorbed in the memories of today's summoning class, recalling the words of Professor Aaron, who said that skeletons formed with summoning magic have a tendency to take their original form, and showed how easily two bones can be joined as if by attraction. The official name for this phenomenon is restoring force. Simon also remembered that this phenomenon was also called the attraction in the field. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and focused on his inner sense. And he began to clearly feel every bone scattered around the room. Nothing else mattered to him now. Because skeletons have a tendency to go back to their original form, so if he remembers the sequence, assembly shouldn't be hard. With a rattling sound, the bones that had been lying close to each other began to slowly move closer together. Simon looked closely at the skull, which was quietly clicking on the floor, and he had an idea. Instead of manually reassembling each bone by hand, he could simply use summoning magic to make them reassemble themselves to their original shape. So he stood up and pointed his hand at the pile of bones on the floor and said, "Restore." And in a moment, the skull's red eyes lit up and the whole room was filled with the sound of bones breaking. Dick was a little scared as the bones started flying by him with a whistle. A minute later, with the last snaps and clicks, the whole island ratman was on the floor of the room. Dick remarked that it was incredible to see the skeleton put itself together, and Simon was pleased that he could entertain his friend a little. Meanwhile, Ratman was running and jumping around the room. Dick was very sleepy and yawning, but he still wanted to know how Simon could do it even without training. But eventually sleep overcame his curiosity. He told Simon that it was late and he was very sleepy, he should go to bed. Then he asked Simon if he was going to sleep, but he couldn't get enough of his summon. He kept petting his Ratman and said that he wanted to try it out more. Dick didn't mind and he would just go to bed first. But before he went to bed, Simon managed to ask him what time was their first class tomorrow. Dick asked again, "Tomorrow?" And he immediately answered, "Darkness Dynamics." While they were talking, Simon was stroking his skeleton and his eyes changed from red to midnight blue. Dick had long since fallen asleep, and Simon was still sitting on the floor studying the diagram, his skeleton sitting across from him, tapping its bones softly. Simon was wondering how he could connect the bones so that the knees could rotate, although they might be Ratman's bones, but maybe they could move like human bones if he put them in a different order. He held one of the bones in his hands and thought about what to do with it. But after twisting the bone in his hands, he came to the conclusion that it wouldn't. Just putting the Ratman's inverted joint. The other way around wouldn't work. He began to add and correct something in his notes. He wrote the following: the assembly formulas are the standards that necromancers have established over a long time, so there must have been numerous trials and errors to get to this point. Just like he is now. Every task has its reason and meaning, and after repeating the assembly himself, he realized how great the previous generations of necromancers were. After the inspection, he put the skeleton's leg back in place. Then he added another arm, trying to replace number 25 with number 31. He asked his creatures if they were comfortable, to which they swung their heads in different directions. He realized that this combination was not very good and decided to put the bones back in their places. Then he thought that no matter how reasonable the structure is, there is always a more efficient way to assemble a motor mechanism for a skeleton. He wondered how he could learn all this quickly. He picked up the book and decided that he would research this question in more detail. He remembered his father, whose skeletons had helped people with their possessions. And Lorraine, whose skeletons had helped them deal with a gang that had attacked him. He looked at his Ratman, whose eyes burned with blue darkness, and wondered what he was missing compared to his father and Lorraine. Simon just couldn't wait for his next summonology class to learn more. The next morning at the first class, the students were listening to a lecture on darkness dynamics. The professor stood in front of the class and told them how important darkness dynamics was to the students. The professor's name was Eric Ora, and he was the one who was going to teach the class. He was quite monotonous in his talk, which caused most of the students to doze off, but not Simon, who was listening intently. The professor asked a rhetorical question: so then how does this darkness create the miracle that is black magic? And went on to explain that to answer this question they needed to understand the flow of darkness, runic words, and the mechanisms of the magic circle. Professor Eric Ora decided to delve into history and explain to them the origin of runic words, which had its roots in the eternally burning torch of the Temple of Del. Initially, none of the ancient people wondered why this torch never went out, even though no one fed it with fuel. Simon was fascinated, while the other students were already falling asleep from boredom. The professor continued, telling them that the wizards and necromancers who discovered and researched the ancient runic words made countless improvements to create the modern runes of today. He began drawing runes and magic circles on the board, commenting that runic words after all the improvements today look like this, and these two magic circles are examples of how the improved runic words are used. This magic circle on the left that they saw could not have been activated. And the difference between it and that circle on the right, which can be activated, is how the runic words are used. Simon listened carefully and took notes. The professor continued, and the students took notes that thanks to the corrective devices they used they had the ability to use the darkness more freely and quickly even without training. Finally, the boring lecture was over and the professor put the piece of chalk back, but before all the students left, he gave them a homework assignment to do before the next class. The assignment was as follows: they had to use one of the magic circles that could not be activated that were demonstrated for them as an example and then provide possible ways to modify it, with the corresponding calculations and formulas they used to make those circles work. The bell rang to announce the end of the lesson. And the teacher said that in the next class he would call 3 students to present their assignments. And he said goodbye to them, saying that he was looking forward to seeing them next time. After the lesson was over, Simon and Dick went outside on their way to the next class, which was to be held outdoors. They complained to each other about how difficult darkness dynamics was. Dick compared it to the arithmetic he learned with his father, wondering why he couldn't just memorize a formula, but had to understand the principles. However, Simon noted that it wasn't so bad. Although he didn't understand more than half of it, he liked the way the professor described everything in order, starting with the principles. Dick countered that he just loves everything about Kizen. Even this morning, when he was admiring the soap in the bathroom, Simon hit his friend on the shoulder for this remark. The island looked incredible in the sunshine as our friends walked farther and farther away from the school buildings. As they walked across the dandelion-filled meadow, Dick asked Simon what class they were going to. Simon replied that they were going to a magic combat class. When they arrived at the clearing where their lesson was to take place, the professor was nowhere to be seen and they were beginning to have doubts about whether they had come to the right place. When Jamie Victoria pointed somewhere to the side, attracting the attention of everyone present. A cloud of dust was approaching them with a thud and they did not understand who or what it could be and why the ground was shaking so much. A flock of creatures was running toward them. It turned out that it was a whole flock of hippos running right at the frightened students. The frightened students gathered in a circle and trembled as the pack of hippos surrounded them and ran around. The students did not understand what was happening and where the hippos came from. But suddenly someone from the middle of the pack greeted them. A guy was sitting on one of the hippos and he told them that Professor Hongping would be teaching his class today in the Roque Mountains. So they all had to get on the hippos to get there quickly. The students and our two friends were not at all excited about the prospect of riding these animals. Dick said that he was not surprised at all, because the professor of magic combat is known in Kizen for being a weirdo. He had even heard that she camps in different parts of the Roque Mountains. Simon couldn't quite believe it. Some of the students began to resent the fact that they had to ride it, even though the hippos looked friendly enough. But the noble students demanded that they put a rug or something on the animal's back before they got on. But the man who brought the hippos here was not at all happy with this attitude and began to gather darkness around his feet. And then he jumped incredibly high with a flip in the air under the admiring gazes of the students. And he began to land directly on that disgruntled nobleman who was shocked by this turn of events. And the man landed right on top of him, driving him into the ground. The others began to complain about what he had done. How could he stand in their way? They were Kizen students, how dare he be so brazen? The man asked again, a servant? He angrily told them how uneducated the new students were these days. He told the already frightened students that they should call him Ta, not servant. The students began to nervously apologize, especially the one on the ground. Simon, watching this scene, commented that they don't change, do they? Dick completely agreed with him and added that he was an exception to the nobility. After dealing with the impudent nobles, the man told everyone that they were a little behind schedule, so everyone had to get on the hippos quickly. One hippo could carry 3 students, and our two friends immediately chose one and began to get on it, some more successfully, some less. Dick finally managed to get on the back and sit behind Simon and whined about how big these hippos were and how difficult it was to climb them. Simon noticed a little girl trying to climb on their animal as well. While she was trying to climb, their guide saw that almost everyone could see and was about to give the animals the command to move. Simon asked her if she needed help and offered her his hand to help her up. She grabbed his hand and was very grateful for the help. Simon quickly lifted her up and sat her down in front of him. The guide told them to hold on tight. And he commanded the hippos, let's go. They quickly ran off with the students on their backs, kicking up clouds of smoke. During this fast trip, the girl Simon helped tried to thank him, but because of the speed and stomping, she only gave Simon a few slaps with her hair and he heard nothing. The other students were in no better shape, almost falling over and wondering what they had to hold on to. The man advised them to overcome this test with a strong will, because this was also part of the test. And he smilingly reminded them that if they fell, the hippos running after them would trample them and they would die. This seemingly logical message only made the students have more questions. Ta continued to frighten the students by telling them that every year there are 1 or 2 accidents in which students die. Frightened, they began to beg for help, demanding that he stop and let them get down to the ground. But Ta was relentless and told them to just keep going, because Kizen doesn't need students who can't hold on to a hippo. Finally, they arrived at a clearing in the mountains, and after such an intense trip, all the students were lying on the grass and were glad to be alive. One of the professor's assistants walked among them and offered each of them a bottle of water. The students were so exhausted that some of them could not even say thank you properly. What a grueling start to the class. Simon, Dick and their new friend sat together on the grass and drank water from the bottles, and it was really nice for them to relax and drink some water after such a trip. But suddenly the girl noticed that birds were flying overhead, which worried her a little bit. And the birds didn't just come for no reason. Someone came up to them and greeted them, saying, "Welcome to my class, everyone." The friends almost choked on their water from this voice, and the water stood up in their throats. The professor had a bird sitting on her shoulder, which also greeted the students with joy. The professor greeted them and introduced herself. Her name was Hongping Tun Soka Marlat. She smilingly informed them that she would be teaching their magic combat class this semester and punched her chest to confirm. A bit of history. This is what the giant undead monster that burned 4 feudal lords to the ground looked like and was called Kundar Hydra. It was this monster that Hongpeng fought. Professor Hongpeng is a legend among necromancers because she once fought a mega undead monster for 5 days and she broke all of its 100 necks by herself to win a dramatic victory. And now she was teaching the new generations of necromancers how to fight magically. Now she asked all the students to stand up and to line up in a column of vurs. But the students did not understand what she wanted from them and what the word vurs meant. One of the assistants came to their aid and explained that the professor meant that they should line up in columns of 4 and move quickly. It was only then that the students realized what was being asked of them. When they lined up, the professor said that it was good and now they would go now, but this time the students had questions about where to go. But she didn't answer them and quickly ran down the slope without waiting for anyone, leaving a bunch of confused students behind. But after a moment of hesitation, they were all running after her, as she told them that they should have a sound mind and a sound body. And that the basis of magic combat begins with physical fitness. The students watched her with admiration and agreed that she was incredible and wondered how she could run like that. Simon thought that they also had 2 arms and 2 legs, but their professor was on a completely different level. She continued that the basis of the subject of magical combat is to enhance one's body with darkness and learn combat strategies that their body can use. But there was something strange in her pronunciation of the words, and so the students who ran after her did not understand everything she said. The professor was saying that necromancers who mainly use magic combat are called the battle necromancers. If they reach a certain level of training, the darkness will flow over their bodies as softly as silk. It will also form something similar in shape to a garment that necromancers call the dark robe. This is the very skill that characterizes combat necromancers, and she also warned them to be careful, because of the large number of trees ahead. Poor Dick, who was not used to moving around so much, whined about how he envied the children who had a talent for magical combat. Simon, who looked a little better than him, asked, "Talented kids?" He looked around and saw students running and jumping through trees as if gravity were a joke. And he agreed with Dick that it seemed that while they were suffering here, those students seemed to be having fun. Dick could barely stand up and sweat was pouring down his face. He asked Simon if he was okay. And he answered that yes, he was fine. This answer surprised his friend, who asked him how he could still be fine. Simon told him with a smile that he also had many mountains in his country and it was fun to run around in the mountains like he used to. Dick told him that he was a monster and he was so jealous of him. They kept running until they came to a huge chasm with water raging at the bottom. Professor Hongpeng explained to them that now their task would be to jump over the gap in front of them using the darkness. One of the students hesitantly asked if they really had to jump over it. Hongpeng said they could do it using one little trick. Just as they were collecting the darkness in their palms, they could instead direct it into their souls. And she was going to show them an example. So she asked them to be careful. The darkness enveloped her souls before she jumped. And she jumped vertically high up the hill under the astonished gazes of the students. But that wasn't all, she added that if you direct the darkness to your souls several times, you can do this. She moved like a shadow and did somersaults and several sideways movements, as if gravity did not affect her at all. She asked if they could see everything, but there was only silence. Simon and Dick were mesmerized by her movements and just stood there with their mouths open in amazement. She continued, emphasizing to them that as they jumped, they should direct all the darkness they had gathered to their feet as if they were going to spray it from their feet. It should feel as if they were pushing off that darkness and it was pushing them forward. And they jumped from one edge of the gap to the other seemingly without effort or problem, landing on the other side and stopping. She invited all the students to jump with her, but there was not much enthusiasm among them. But some students were brave enough to run to the abyss first. They jumped confidently, as if they had already practiced and had the ability to do so. In a moment, they were on the other side. Some of them landed successfully on their feet, others only managed to grab the edge of the cliff. However, the professor praised all of them for their good work. For those who did not succeed, she explained that if they released the darkness too late it could be dangerous. As it was now, she advised them to release the darkness earlier next time and lifted those hanging on the edge by the hand. Simon repeated to himself in concentration, "Push back on the darkness, push back on the darkness." Dick advised him not to overthink it. Simon objected that it seemed too complicated for him. But his friend assured him that overthinking only makes things more difficult and ran to the edge of the cliff, ready to jump. Simon advised him to be careful, but he jumped right away. As he jumped, a shadow flew right over him. It was our old friend and Simon's sworn enemy, Hector, and he jumped much higher than Dick. The two landed with mixed success. Hector's friends immediately began to congratulate him for the highest jump of all. Dick sat on the ground and dusted himself off, thinking to himself that he didn't like this Hector at all and was getting on his nerves. Simon was one of the last to dare to jump, his friend supporting him as best he could from the other side, telling him that Simon could do it, because even he had done it. Simon was still concentrating on preparing for the jump, repeating the professor's instructions. Finally, he felt ready and ran forward. He jumped and gathered all his darkness in his soles and pushed off. Even Hector and his henchmen had to notice how high Simon had jumped, and they had been waiting for him to fail. He was still flying over the cliff when Dick shouted at him that it was incredible. Simon finally landed and everyone began to congratulate him on his wonderful jump. Dick was especially happy that he had wiped Hector's nose. Simon was over the moon. He shouted with joy, "I did it." Even Professor Hongping was amazed and stunned by his jump, not to mention the other students. Almost everyone was happy for him and congratulated him. It was a real victory for him and he could not contain his joy. However, his joy was not shared by everyone. Hector gritted his teeth and furiously held back everything inside him. His hatred for this Simon, who had already beaten him for the second time, was growing more and more. The professor happily announced that everyone seemed to have crossed the chasm, but they had to wait for the students who had fallen a little bit down, and as soon as they got up to them, they would all go to a new area to continue the lesson. Simon was beaming with happiness and answered her happily, "Yes, Professor." On the way back, Dick turned to Simon and asked him, holding out the book, if he wanted to check it out. Dick looked at the book and asked with interest what it was. When he opened the book, he replied that it was a list of students they had to recruit for the group classes that were to start next week. Dick also added that he thought they should start preparing now. In addition, he had already listed and written down everyone's names, strengths, and characteristics in a notebook. Looking at the notes in his friend's notebook, Simon asked with surprise and admiration how he had been able to research all this. To which he replied that it was a trade secret. Watching his friend's joyful face as he continued to talk excitedly in his notebook, Simon couldn't help but notice that while he struggled to keep up with his lectures, Dick managed to find time to observe others even during class. It was clear to him at that moment why he had come to him and not to Hector, for after observing him he had come to the conclusion that he could not get along with him. Turning to Dick, Simon asked him what his opinion was based on the results of the study. He hid his notebook and replied that most of the students in their class were highly qualified, and all of them were pretty good, but, pointing to the pink-haired girl who rode the hippo with them, Dick noted that she might be expelled as soon as the protective period expired. Adding that there were only 2 kids in their class who couldn't jump over the abyss, and this girl was one of them. She was also very shy, which could lead to bullying. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard from Professor Hongpeng, who started running and shouted to the students to follow her as they were already delayed. The tired students who were hoping for a break sighed pitifully. Simon, saying that this class was so fun and dynamic, followed her with eager eyes, while Dick, who did not particularly share his enthusiasm, marveled once more at his friend's fervor. The next instant, however, something caught Simon's eye. Suddenly a pack of hippopotamuses appeared in the distance and rushed toward the students, creating dust and vibrations on the ground. When some students saw this, they immediately reported it to Professor Hongpeng, hoping that she would be able to help them. However, to their confusion, it was as if the professor had fallen underground and she was nowhere to be found. Realizing this and seeing a herd of hippos running straight at them, the students panicked. Realizing the pitifulness of the situation, Simon noted that it was very bad and something had to be done. Standing in front of the hippos that were about to reach him, he gathered the darkness in his legs. Then at the last moment he jumped high into the air in front of the hippo. Remembering Dick's words that they would not be in any danger during the students' defense period, he was confused, for he could not understand whether it was all a setup or not. Still in the air, he concluded that if someone could not dodge, he would probably be badly hurt. However, as it turned out, his worries were in vain. The students were able to avoid the bull's attack without any problems. Some cast a curse of exhaustion, others blocked the attack with a shield or simply climbed into trees where they were out of range of the behemoths. Dropping to the ground near Simon suddenly appeared Cindy, who greeted him with a smile on her face. As he landed and realized that it was too early for him to play hero and worry about others, Simon heard someone call out to him. It was Dick, hanging from the pole, who asked him if he was all right, to which Simon nodded affirmatively. There were some worries, however, that he had underestimated his classmates, and now he realized that in the future he would have to compete with thousands of them. Seeing his friend's downcast look, Dick told him not to worry too much about anything, for all these behemoths were under the control of Professor Hongping. Adding that she was a master of magical combat, but could also use the druid bloodline. When he was on top, he saw the hippos running around the guys who had fallen to the ground. Simon was a bit surprised by this information as he thought things had gotten out of hand. The instructor arrived and said that the guys had no time to sit around and should get up and start moving. They sighed with fatigue and started to rise to their feet. The instructor kept pushing the students, motivating them by the fact that the hippopotamuses were going back soon, and also adding that the professor was waiting for all of them downstairs. The pink-haired girl staggered to her feet with tears in her eyes and stood up abruptly, saying excitedly that she understood. A light breeze blew between the trees. The students ran out of the forest and into a clearing, the beauty of which took everyone's breath away, and with wide open and amazed eyes, they all stared at the picture before their eyes. In the middle of the clearing dotted with flowers stood their Hongping professor, who said that there were no more obstacles and called them to her. With delight, all the students rushed to run to her through the incredibly beautiful green meadow, the beauty of which overwhelmed everyone with excitement. When everyone had arrived, the professor said that now they could rest. Then remembering something added that despite the fact that they were supposed to eat only after a glass, she considering how tired they were had contacted Kizen in advance. The students were puzzled, but everything became immediately clear after the professor pointed her finger at something. It was lunch, which was delivered to the students right there. When the professor asked what her idea was, the students broke out into joyous shouts saying that it was the best. Sitting in the lotus posture and holding the tray of food on his lap, Dick noted that Professor Hongping was not like the others. Feeding students in her own class was not what one would expect from all the other strict teachers. However, Simon had a question about this very thing. Even before entering the academy, he had heard a slightly different opinion. Namely that Professor Hongping was one of the most typical professors at Kizen. To which Dick contemptuously asked where Simon had heard this nonsense. He answered nothing, thinking to himself that Lorraine would probably not have deceived him. Their conversation was interrupted by the professor, who turned to the students and told them that they had to finish. Some of the students were surprised to be leaving this beautiful place so soon. But Simon had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something. Turning to the students who had gathered in front of her, Professor Hongping asked if they had the bracelets she had given them, to which they amicably replied that they did. She then told the students to let the darkness penetrate them. This action caused the students to immediately feel incredibly heavy and weak, and some of them even fell to their knees not understanding what was going on. The professor, with a smile on her face, pointed to the man with the flag behind her and asked the students if they were all familiar with the curse of exhaustion. She then informed them that their assignment would be to climb the hill with the curse of weakness on it, adding that everyone should be prepared. Then, with a devilish smile on her face, she turned to the students and added that she would be watching them closely. Unable to believe Professor Hongping's new assignment, the weary students didn't want to do another assignment so difficult. Unfortunately, however, they didn't have much of a choice. The next moment, the professor ordered everyone to take their seats. The slumped students, being under the curse of weakening, lined up in a row, barely able to stand on their feet. After the students lined up, Professor Hongping started counting down. The very next moment, she commanded to begin, and the students immediately rushed to run up the mountain towards the flag. After a while, however, the run turned into a very slow walk, each step of which was very difficult. The farther up the hill the students climbed, the closer to the ground they became, some of them even went on all fours. Shaking hands grasped the grass, rocks, and anything else they could grab onto. Simon was no exception, and crawled through the grass like the others. Every step was difficult, and he felt dizzy. But it was nothing compared to the preparatory training, and it was all about endurance and willpower. So he could not give up now, because then he would no longer be able to catch up with the pace of the next classes and would be left behind forever, and that was the decision he made. "I will do it no matter what," Simon said to himself in a firm voice as he prepared himself for the challenge he had to overcome. Hector, who was also climbing on all fours and who was only a little taller than Simon, saw him catching up with him and snorted irritably, as he could once again prevent him from taking the first place. He was angry and surprised that even though he had weakened the fatigue spell with his own techniques to get ahead, Simon had managed to keep up with him even without any tricks. But Hector wasn't about to give up. And with more speed he decided that this time he would definitely win. Standing at the top of the mountain, Professor Hongping cheered up the guys telling them that they were almost there. Hector and Simon were ahead of them, crawling on all fours, and they were crawling to the finish line with all their might. And each of them was not going to lose to the other. Holding out their hands, they said to themselves that this time they would definitely take first place. But their hopes were not to be realized. A foot stepped in front of their outstretched arms. It was none other than Maylene Willen. She walked lightly to the flag as if not feeling the fatigue. Professor Hongping immediately announced that she had won first place, while Simon and Hector stared at the girl with shocked looks, not understanding how this could be. After congratulating the girl on her victory, Professor Hongping asked her what she had done to walk as if there was no curse on her. To which she replied that she had simply unlocked the resistance formula of the fatigue curse. A little surprised and praising the girl, the professor told the one that she could rest. Hearing this, Simon and Hector were even more shocked, as they didn't know that breaking the curse wasn't forbidden by the rules. Suddenly one of the assistants turned to the professor and told him that they had a student with a sprained ankle, to which she immediately replied that she would take a look. She waved goodbye and congratulated them on being almost there and headed off to help, leaving Simon at a loss. With an annoyed sigh, Hector got to his feet and headed up the hill, saying irritably that he must be being bullied. After he climbed the mountain, the professor's assistant immediately informed him that he had won second place. Simon was left sitting on the ground not knowing what to do. Hector approached Maylin, who was sitting under a tree. He asked her in an annoyed voice why she had broken the curse even though they were in a magic class, adding that she wasn't the only one who could do it. However, the girl looked away and said she didn't care what he said. But Hector didn't want to be ignored and said that she really didn't know anything about the world, since she lived like a princess imprisoned in a tower. Maylene looked at him and asked him if he wanted to fight her. He replied that he had no intention of doing so, but was only telling her the truth, saying that professors don't evaluate them during the defense period. However, during that time it's important to show that you're doing well to get attention. Adding that what she just did will most likely only take away Professor Hongpeng's trust. Not intending to be lectured by him, the girl mockingly asked if he was so hurt by the defeat that he decided to take it out on her. He replied that he was just telling her to stay out of his way. Then turning around and intending to leave, he added that he had no interest in her at all. At the same moment, the instructor handed Simon, who had crawled to the finish line, a bottle of water and told him that he had taken third place. With a sigh of relief he leaned against a tree and sat down on the ground. Maylin and Hector, who were nearby, immediately looked at him. They stood silently waiting for the other participants to arrive. Falling on the grass beside Simon, Dick, tired and worn out, complained to his friend that he felt as if he were going to die. He praised him, saying that he had done a good job, adding that he was tired too. Looking up at the sky, catching flashbacks of the day's events, Dick asked Simon what he thought about how they were going to get home. And would they have to climb the hippopotamuses again, adding that if they did, it would be better to bite their tongues off and not suffer. Suddenly Professor Hongping turned to the students again, mispronounced a word. She told them to gather together. There was a magic circle on the ground in front of the students gathered in a pile. Professor Hongping explained that since everyone looked very tired, she had contacted the academy again and was allowed to use the teleportation magic circle. Then she told everyone to get in line. The surprised and tired students were incredibly happy about this gift. Simon and Dick waited for their turn to enter the circle. Simon was surprised to see that the teleportation sensations were new to him. However, the landing after teleportation was quite painful, as his landing spot was a wooden table, which he landed on with a shriek and a thud. Rubbing his back and not seeing the familiar surroundings, he wondered where he had gotten to, as he didn't think he had gotten to the academy. However, a voice confirmed his hunch, saying that he had indeed gotten to the wrong place. The voice apologized to him for scaring him. Recognizing the voice, Simon turned around and was surprised to see Professor Hongpeng, who turned to him and told him to sit down, adding that she would explain why he was here. Without waiting for Simon to sit down, the professor informed him that the magic circle had been modified in some unknown way, and after examining it, it became known that someone had added a formula to make it react to the darkness of a particular person. Heading towards the table, Simon asked in a surprised voice, was it really him? The professor handed him a metal mug and said that it was, so when the circle was activated it didn't go to Kizen. Pouring water from the kettle into the cup, she asked him if he had any idea who could have done it. He replied confusedly that he had no idea who it could be. Laughing, Professor Hongpeng told him not to worry, because her job was to protect the students, and that was why he had come to her house. However, she added that she wanted to talk to him personally, which surprised him. Putting her hands together, the professor said that it was against the rules to talk to students during the defense period, but from what she had seen there were already professors who had broken that rule. Simon Valencia. She turned to Simon, who replied excitedly. Don't you want to choose magical combat as your profile? She asked, looking at the boy. She added that if he wanted to she would be willing to take him on as an apprentice. A little puzzled, Simon asked if it meant that he would become her personal student. Professor Hongping replied that it was correct, saying that she would be responsible for his training since professors treat their students with full seriousness and responsibility. She added that the performance of direct students was directly related to the professor's reputation, so they could only choose 3 students from each year. She looked at Simon and said that this was the opportunity she wanted to give him. She held out her hand and asked the confused boy if he was ready to be her student. He asked Professor Hongping why she had offered it to him, because he had not done well in class today. He could hardly keep up with the other students, and he could only come third on the hill. Besides, today was only the second day of school, so he was sure that her decision to offer him such a thing was not well thought out. The professor, however, folded her hands in front of her with a smile on her face and told him that rankings might be important to students, but professors looked at talent. Then she reminded him of the moment when they jumped over the river using darkness and asked him if it was the first time he had ever used darkness. To which he replied that she was right. To which the professor replied that even though it was the first time he had used darkness, he had jumped higher than all the students in the class, which was no longer a matter of talent or coincidence. In addition, when climbing the hill he only used his stamina and willpower, unlike those two. Then she added, looking at the confused Simon, that even if he thought he hadn't demonstrated anything, he was mistaken, for it was enough for her. When she finished she asked him with a smile if he wanted more compliments. Without waiting for an answer, she continued, saying that his stamina, thinking and incredible talent in using darkness were the best for choosing magic combat. Adding that they were so good that he would surpass even her in a couple years. But even that wasn't the limit, the professor said with confidence in her voice that if she trained him she could make him stronger than anyone. Simon, sitting on the chair, listened to Professor Hongping's words carefully. He turned to her and thanked her for her generosity in offering to be his student. However, he bowed low and said that he would like to decline. She immediately asked him the reason. Simon replied in a slightly guilty voice that he would like to study another field more deeply at the moment. Upon hearing the answer, Professor Hongping smiled and said that it was fine, adding that she was grateful to him for telling her right away so that she wouldn't have any more questions. However, she added that her agreement did not mean that she would give up on working with him. Hearing this, Simon asked in surprise what she meant. The professor replied that she had already told him about the profile, so she would try her best to change his mind. Simon was surprised at her determination, so he asked her why she was going so far. She replied that it was just personal curiosity, adding that she just wanted to see how strong he could grow. With a wave of her hand that left a blue magical glow behind her, she said that it wasn't just about him becoming her apprentice. Adding that he could come to her for help whenever he wanted. Illuminated by the bright magical glow that made him squint his eyes, Simon thanked the professor. Having finished creating the teleportation circle, Professor Hongping turned to Simon and told him that she didn't want him to tell anyone about the dialogue. She added that the circle had transported him to Kizen, to which he smiled and replied that he was glad. Waving goodbye, she said with a smile that she would see him at the next class. Stepping onto the teleportation circle, and turning to the professor, Simon said goodbye with a smile on his face. She looked at the guy as he walked away and thought about something, but she didn't hear the voice calling her. The next moment the door opened and the professor's assistant came into the room and asked her how it went. To which she replied that he had refused. Hearing this, the man immediately became indignant, asking how the guy dared to refuse her, and then he suggested the professor to take Hector as a student, who in his opinion was more talented in magical combat. But he was interrupted by the professor, saying only 2 words, "He's a genius." The assistant standing at the door questioned what she meant. She folded her arms across her chest and said that she had seen many geniuses in Kizen, but she'd never met one like this. He opened the bathroom door. Simon walked in and met Dick, who was toweling his head. He immediately asked him why he'd come in so late. Simon replied that there had been a problem with his teleportation. Realizing that he was all right, Dick said enthusiastically that Simon had no idea what had just happened to him. Not understanding why his friend was so excited, Simon asked what had happened. He replied that when he teleported into the circle, there was a rumbling noise that froze his body. And after he came to himself, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar place. As it turned out, he found himself in the office of Professor Bahil, who was sitting in his chair emitting an eerie aura. Surprised, Simon asked Dick if it was the same professor from the Department of Catarology, and he proudly replied that it was. Simon asked him what had happened afterwards, wanting to hear the rest of the story. Dick replied that afterward the professor had made him clean his office. In spite of what he was doing, Dick's eyes lit up with joy, because according to the Kizen alumni, professors often guide students in this way. Adding that this was probably what had happened to him and he probably had a chance to be his student. When he realized this, he started jumping up and down and shouting about how cool it was to be a direct student of the professor, because he could enjoy his school life, and if he was a direct student of the professor, he could avoid even being expelled. Simon tried to calm down his restless friend. But he clenched his hand into a fist and said that he couldn't calm down so easily. Hector, who had heard the noise Dick had made, said it was the stupidest nonsense he had ever heard, adding scornfully that a pathetic commoner like him would never be a direct student of Professor Bahil. Hearing the boy's contemptuous words, Dick mockingly asked him if he was so hurt by the words, asking if it was because the professors weren't looking at more than just him. Being angry at the guy's words, Hector said in an irritated voice to watch his words. However, Dick was not going to back down, saying that he had seen the likes of him many times before. Then he added in a mocking voice that he had heard that he had almost fought with Mei Lin in the magic combat class. Then he added that they were equals in this place, so he advised him to stop pretending that he had an advantage because he was trained by the Moore family. He then said that it was probably not Mei Lin who didn't know how the world worked, but him. These words made Hector furious. In the next moment, a large red magic circle appeared in his hand, which was aimed directly at Dick. As a result, many strands of red magic smoke coiled around the guy's body, which, judging by the expression on Dick's face, brought him quite a lot of pain. Simon rushed to his friend, asking what was wrong with him. But Hector did not plan to stop there. He lifted Dick off the ground with his magic and called him a pathetic piece of trash. He slammed him against the wall, angrily asking how he dared to treat him like that. Then he stared at him with a fierce look of murderous intent. He said in a furious voice that he would kill him. Then he intensified his attack and started choking the guy even harder. Simon, who had been standing aside all this time, did not rush at Hector as you might think. No, he just shouted Dick's name in a panic. He grinned despite the pain of the curse. Then gave him the middle finger and mockingly said he could try. One of Hector's friends, who realized that something irreparable might happen, grabbed his hand and asked him to calm down and not to cross the line, as it was forbidden to use magic outside of lessons. However, with a single blow of his hand, telling them to shut up, he threw him and another guy backward, causing them to fall to the ground. However, in the next instant he sensed something and looked with his eyes that were like Naruto's that were under the control of the nine-tailed fox in the direction from where the danger was felt. Despite the suddenness of the attack, he managed to block the blow, which was delivered by none other than Simon, who stopped dumbfounded and came to his senses and rushed to save his friend. However, this was not unexpected for Hector, who was just waiting for him to jump into the fray. Simon covered his friend with his hands and glared angrily at Hector. Simon punches Hector, but he blocks. Despite that punch being powerful, he slid back, holding his stance. He said that he was expecting Simon to intervene at some point. The curse weakened Dick, so he could not stay at his feet. Simon stood before him, determined to defend his friend. Hector started forming darkness in his hand. He was finally going to show everybody who is strongest here. But when he almost formed the curse, the thrown brick of soap shattered it. They turned their heads and saw Kizen. He looked ominous. He had only a towel cinched around his waist so they could see his muscular upper body with scars. He commanded them to keep it down, warning that he would break their necks if they did not. Hector ignored that and wondered how Kizen was still staying in school. His friends were terrified. They heard rumors that that guy got suspended for beating up other kids. However, Hector couldn't be easily scared and threatened Kizen to watch out. He added that he will not let things slide like this again. At this moment, the guys behind Kizen thanked him for help. But he turned back to go out, telling them to shut up, and left, slamming the door. Simon remarked that Kizen is a good person despite his appearance. Dick completely agreed with him. Dick inquired about Simon's weekend plans, to which Simon replied that he had none. Dick explained to Simon that spending weekends with a goal in mind is super important. For example, the weekend schedule is more important for him than weekday classes. He is going to Rachet, a town below the school's land, to make a business there. Money is vital for successfully graduating from Kizen. Despite the school paying living expenses for students, it's not nearly enough to advance to higher grades. Dick would like an academic scholarship for extra money but couldn't get the required high grades. So, he would use his special abilities as early as possible to earn money. He also advised Simon to figure out how to earn extra cash. Professors aren't going to give out in-class materials for free like now once the student protection period ends. The money you get from school isn't enough to buy all the needed materials. So, all upperclassmen have their ways of earning money. And also, because of Simon's interest in summonology, he needs money the most. For this scholarship, students need a lot of expensive materials. Simon replied that he never thought they needed to be self-sufficient in extracurricular activities to survive in school. This thing startled him. Dick offered that he establishes himself in Rocha's town so he would be able to arrange some job for Simon. But Simons told him that he must learn to make money independently. Dick gathered all the needed things and said he was going out to take care of tomorrow's schedule. But Simon worried that then was a late hour and what would be if the headmaster caught Dick. Dick told him that despite the strictness of school, they respected autonomy, so it was okay as long as he didn't get caught. Dick left, and Simon remained alone. He was sitting, eating snacks, and thinking what to do right now. Suddenly, someone appeared outside of the window. He had heard sounds, turned his head, and saw Archbold glancing at him from the window. He opened the window for her and asked how she got there on the 4th floor. She didn't give a serious answer and just climbed into the room. They sat together in the room, and he treated her to snacks. She was happy to have them because she couldn't eat sweets at home. She asked how his first time at school was. He told her it was fun because the professors were incredible, everyone was nice, and the classes were fun. He thinks that he is well suited for this school. Despite a bit of struggle at first with help from friends, he got used to it. She light-mindedly replied that she thought he might suffer a lot because he arrived at school without learning anything beforehand. Nephthys told him their conversation reminded her of when Richard studied at the same place. Simon couldn't believe that his father was also a Kizen school student. She said that Richard was no joke and that although I seemed very mature, he was quite the troublemaker and a walking disaster. On top of that, he was too clever for his own good. He used to get himself into trouble by mocking the professors and attempting to skip classes. On several occasions, he had to be physically brought back to class to ensure he didn't miss out on important lessons. Simon couldn't believe what he'd heard. Father, who he knew was completely different. So he asked Nephthys Archbold if his father graduated from school and was shocked to hear that he dropped out. She said that the school was too small for such exceptional student. She described him as a special case in many ways. Being young at that time, she couldn't handle him that well. Nephthys plopped down on the bed on her back, remembering her youth. And then she suddenly got up from bed while saying that his father practically turned the whole Roke Island upside down. So, if Simon looks closely, he might find traces of his father. She advised him to pay close attention to that for a more enjoyable school life. And then she told him she should leave because she had a schedule. When she climbed out the window, she thanked him for the snacks and left him origami. Unfolded origami turned out to be a map with his location and skull drawn as a destination by a dashed line. He remembered what she told him about his father's deeds and decided that this map somehow connected. He walked in the forest at night. It was filled with owls' hoots and other scary sounds. Simon already wasn't sure that it was a good idea.